The heavy wooden door of the Harris County Courthouse in Houston, Texas, let out a soft creak as it swung open. Light from the hallway spilled in, illuminating the glossy marble floor, where the tiny, hesitant footsteps of Lily Harper, a 5-year-old girl, echoed softly. In her hand was Alicia's shadow, a German shepherd with sleek black fur tinged with hints of golden brown, his deep-set eyes glinting with alertness. A long, jagged scar ran down Shadow's right side, telling an untold story of the dangers he had faced in the past. All eyes in the courtroom, from the jurors and lawyers to the packed audience, were fixed on Lily and Shadow. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the gentle breaths of the little girl and the rhythmic tapping of Shadow's paws on the floor. Lily wore a light blue dress, her tiny white shoes covered in dust from the long hallway leading here. Her curly brown hair was neatly tied back with a white bow, but her small hands trembled as she tightly gripped the leash. Shadow walked beside her, head slightly bowed, ears perked up like radar, sensing every movement in the space. This wasn't Shadow's first time in a tense place like this. Having been AK-9 for the Houston Police Department, it was familiar with life-and-death moments. But today, it wasn't here to chase down criminals. It was here for Lily, the girl it had bonded with as if she were a part of itself. On the defendant's bench, James Carver sat still, his hands clasped together on the table. At 45, he looked just like an ordinary software engineer, a crisp white shirt, wire-rimmed glasses, and neatly combed hair. But behind that harmless facade was a cold gaze, a smirk that flickered across his face as he glanced at Lily. He was charged with the attempted kidnapping of a young girl, a case that, if lost, could send him away for life. But James was confident. There was no physical evidence, no confession, and most importantly, the only witness, Lily, hadn't uttered a word since that fateful day. Judge Daniel Pierce, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and sharp, piercing eyes, sat high up in his chair, looking down at the entire room. With over 20 years of experience on the bench, he had witnessed all kinds of cases, from petty thieves to cold-blooded criminals. But today, something felt different. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, watching as Lily approached the witness stand. The small shoulders of the little girl seemed to bear the weight of the world, and Daniel knew that the entire case hinged on what she could or couldn't say. Lily stopped in front of the witness stand, her green eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding anyone's gaze. Her mother, Sarah Harper, stood a few steps away, her hands clenched together until they turned pale. Sarah wore a gray sweater, her hair hastily tied back, and her eyes were filled with worry. Next to her was John Harper, Lily's father, a tall man whose physique still bore the marks of his years in the U.S. Marine Corps. John had served at Camp Pendleton, California, where he forged a steel will and a fighting instinct. Now he sat silently, his hands gripping the edge of the chair, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Since the day Lily was attacked, the cheerful voice that once brightened their home had vanished, replaced by a haunting silence. "Lily, can you sit up on a chair?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She leaned down, gently lifting her daughter onto the tall wooden chair that was too high for Lily's little legs. Lily nodded softly, saying nothing, her hand still tightly gripping Shadow's leash. The dog settled right beside her, head held high, eyes scanning the room like a sentry. John looked at Shadow, and in that moment he felt a strange resonance, just like the trust he used to have in his comrades during those perilous nights on patrol in Iraq. Shadow was not just a therapy dog. He was Lily's protector, the last glimmer of hope for the Harper family. Prosecutor Anna Mitchell, a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, stepped up to the podium. She wore a sharp black suit, her voice clear yet warm. "Your Honor, we are here today to try the case against the defendant, James Carver, who is accused of attempting to abduct Lily Harper on May 15, 2024, in the Spring Branch neighborhood of Houston." Anna paused, glancing at Lily, then continued. "Our only witness is a 5-year-old girl who has endured a horror that no child should ever have to face, and she will need the support of her therapy dog, Shadow, to participate in this trial." James's defense attorney, Robert Klein, shot up from his seat. He was around 50, with salt and pepper hair, and a deep yet sharp voice. "Your Honor, I object." The presence of a dog, especially a large German shepherd, in the courtroom will emotionally sway the jury, tipping the scales of justice in favor of the plaintiff. We request that this animal be removed. Robert crossed his arms, staring directly at Daniel Pierce, as if daring him to make a decision. Daniel slammed his gavel down on the table, the loud sound startling everyone in the room. "I've reviewed the documents from the child psychologist and the animal behavior expert," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "Shadow is allowed to stay. This isn't about emotions. It's about the necessity for the witness to participate in the trial." He glanced over at Lily, then at Shadow, and in that moment, he felt a strange intuition that this dog was not just here to provide comfort, but to do something far greater. Lily sat still, her tiny hands gripping the leash tightly. Shadow lifted his head, his nose twitching as if he sensed something in the air. James Carver, from the defendant's table, smirked, his gaze sweeping over the little girl and the dog. He had no idea that, at this very moment, the wheels of justice had begun to turn, and they wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. The sound of Judge Daniel Pierce's gavel still echoed in the air of the Harris County Court as the entire room fell into a heavy silence. The decision to allow Shadow to stay had caught Robert Klein, James Carver's defense attorney, off guard. He stood there, his lips pressed tightly together, a flicker of irritation in his eyes before he finally sat down. But James Carver remained unfazed. He sat still in the defendant's chair, his hands tightly clasped, his cold gaze sweeping over Lily Harper and the dog Shadow, as if he were assessing a chess piece on a board. To him, this was just a game, and he believed he held the trump card, Lily's silence. On the witness stand, Lily sat curled up, her tiny feet swinging a few inches above the floor. The wooden chair was far too big for her little body, making her look even more fragile in the vast space of the courtroom. Her hands gripped the leash of Shadow tightly, her fingers pale from the pressure. Shadow sat below, motionless like a statue, but his ears twitched at every small sound, the soft call from the jury, the rustling of papers from the prosecution's table, or the sigh of Sarah Harper from the audience. The dog seemed to sense everything, just as he had when he detected danger during his days serving with the Houston Police Department. Prosecutor Anna Mitchell stepped closer to the witness stand, the steady click of her high heels echoing on the floor. She leaned down to meet Lily's gaze, her voice gentle like an older sister's. "Lily, you know you don't have to be scared here, right?" Anna smiled, but her eyes sparkled with caution. "You can nod or shake your head if you want. Shadow is right here with you." Lily didn't respond, her emerald green eyes glued to her hands. But then, sensing comfort in Anna's voice, she gave a tiny nod, so small that almost no one noticed except for Shadow. The dog lifted his head, his nose twitching slightly, as if to make sure that she was okay. Anna stood tall, facing the jury. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice sharpening. On the afternoon of May 15th, 2024, in the Spring Branch neighborhood of Houston, Lily Harper narrowly escaped becoming a victim of a brutal kidnapping. A neighbor, Mrs. Margaret Evans, witnessed James Carver approach the little girl with the lure of taking her to see special puppies. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Evans' timely scream, we might not have Lily here with us today. Anna paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across each face in the jury. She knew they needed a moment to grasp the horror of that day. John Harper, from the audience, gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He vividly remembered that afternoon. He had just come home from work, still wearing the jacket of a civilian investigator, when Sarah burst out of the house with Lily in her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He tried to take her, John," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. John held both of them tightly. But when he looked into Lily's eyes, he no longer saw the little girl excitedly telling him about the butterflies in the yard. Instead, there was a terrifying emptiness, like what he had seen in young soldiers after battles in Iraq. As a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, John understood all too well what trauma could do to a soul, whether it belonged to a soldier or a 5-year-old child. Robert Klein stood up once more, interrupting John's train of thought. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm yet calculated. "The plaintiff is trying to paint an emotional picture, but we need to look at the facts. There's no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no security camera footage. The only thing we have is the testimony of an elderly witness, Mrs. Evans, who was standing over 50 feet away in the twilight. And the key witness, Lily Harper, is unable to speak. He turned to the jury, spreading his arms as if inviting their agreement. How can we convict someone based solely on emotion without any truth? Anna immediately rebutted, stepping closer to the prosecutor's table. Your Honor, the truth is that James Carver was identified by Mrs. Evans right at the scene. And Lily's silence is not a weakness. It's evidence of the terror the defendant has caused. We will prove that this is not the first time he has targeted children. Her voice rang out with determination, but inside, Anna knew this case was as fragile as a thread. If Lily couldn't overcome her fear to point out James, all her efforts could go to waste. Daniel Pierce tapped his gavel again, his gaze sweeping across the room. Enough, he said, his voice deep like thunder. We will hear the testimony of the witness. Lily, are you ready? He looked down at the little girl, tried to keep his tone gentle, but inside him, a growing sense of unease was brewing. He had seen many children take the witness stand, but he had never seen a girl so small, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Lily didn't respond. She lowered her head, her curly hair hiding her face. Sarah, from the audience, choked back tears, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a sob. John placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, his gaze shifting from Lily to Shadow. He noticed something in the way the dog was sitting, the way it tilted its head, its nose twitching slightly, as if sensing an invisible threat. Experience from his days in the Marine Corps told him that Shadow was not just their comfort, it was waiting for something. James Carver, from the defendant's table, smirked once more. He tilted his head, looking at Lily like a cat toying with a mouse. He had no idea that, at this very moment, the invisible thread between the girl and the dog was tightening, and it would soon become the noose that would hang him. The tension in the courtroom escalated by the second, like an undercurrent ready to explode, and no one, not even James, could predict what would happen next. The light from the tall windows of the Harris County Courthouse spilled onto the marble floor, casting soft, hazy beams across Lily Harper's face. The little girl sat motionless in the witness chair, her tiny hands gripping Alicia's shadows so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The air in the courtroom felt thick, each breath carrying a hint of tremor. Judge Daniel Pierce leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked onto Lily, not to pressure her, but to search for any sign that might help him understand what she was thinking. But Lily didn't lift her head. Her green eyes were hidden behind a curtain of curly brown hair, like a veil concealing a whole world within. Shadow, the German shepherd, sat beside her, head held high, ears perked up like little antennas. His sleek black coat shimmered in the light, and the long scar on his right flank seemed to tell the story of the days he had rushed into danger without a second thought. Shadow was not just a therapy dog. He was a veteran, just like John Harper, Lily's father. John sat in the audience, hands gripping the armrests, eyes glued to his daughter. He felt the tension in the air, much like he had sensed before an ambush in Iraq. His experience as a U.S. Marine had taught him that silence wasn't always surrender sometimes. It was a sign of a storm brewing. Prosecutor Anna Mitchell stepped closer to Lily, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. She leaned down, her voice soft yet filled with patience. Lily, can you look at me for a moment? Anna asked, her hand gently resting on the edge of the witness stand. The little girl didn't respond right away. A heavy silence stretched out, so thick it felt like the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Then, slowly, Lily lifted her head, her eyes meeting Anna's for a brief moment. It was the first time she looked directly at anyone since entering the courtroom, and Anna felt a jolt of electricity run down her spine. That's good, sweetheart. Anna smiled, her tone warm. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just nod or shake your head, okay? Lily nodded slightly, a small gesture that was enough to make Sarah Harper, from the audience, let out a stifled sob. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. John placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze, as if to say that everything would be all right. But inside, a growing unease was taking hold of him. He glanced over at James Carver, who sat in the defendant's chair with an unchanged smirk. James looked far too calm, far too confident, and that made John suspicious. An innocent person doesn't smile like that when facing kidnapping charges. Anna turned to the jury, her voice sharper now. Ladies and gentlemen, on May 15th, 2024, James Carver approached Lily Harper in her backyard in the Spring Branch area of Houston. He used the lure of special puppies to entice her. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Margaret Evans, a 72-year-old neighbor, shouting from 50 feet away, Lily could have vanished forever. Anna paused, letting her words sink in with each juror. She pointed directly at James. The defendant is not just a threat to Lily. We believe he is connected to several other missing persons cases and area cases that we will prove in this trial. Robert Klein shot up, interrupting Anna. Your Honor, this is baseless speculation. He stepped forward to the defendant's table, his tone low but defiant. The plaintiff has no concrete evidence beyond the testimony of an elderly woman with questionable eyesight and a witness who can't speak. They're trying to fabricate a story to cover their own shortcomings. Robert turned to the jury, his gaze sharp. James Carver is a software engineer with a clean record. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing but vague accusations. Justice cannot be based on emotions. It must be grounded in truth. Daniel Pierce tapped his gavel, the sound echoing and causing Robert to pause. Mr. Klein, that's enough, he said, his voice deep and commanding. I want to hear from the witness. Lily, can you point out who was in the yard with you that day? He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the little girl. The courtroom fell silent, every gaze fixed on Lily. Time seemed to stand still, each passing second heavy as a stone. Lily didn't move right away. She bowed her head, her curly hair hiding her face. Shadow, sitting below, tilted his head slightly, his nose twitching as if he sensed something in the air. Then, slowly, Lily's tiny hands released the leash. She trembled as she raised a finger, pointing toward James Carver. The gesture was weak, but it was enough to send a wave of whispers rippling through the courtroom. For the first time, James lost his smirk. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, though he quickly masked it with a facade of calm. Robert Klein shot up again. Your Honor, I object, he nearly shouted. This gesture is not credible. The girl has been influenced by the pictures of my client throughout the investigation. This is a clear manipulation. His voice echoed, but Daniel Pierce raised his hand to signal for silence. Objection overruled, Daniel said, his voice as firm as steel. The jury will assess the credibility of the witness themselves. He glanced at Lily, then down at Shadow, and a strange intuition stirred within him. The dog remained still, but its eyes were locked onto James Carver, unblinking. There was something in Shadow's gaze that wasn't anger, but recognition. Daniel had seen that look in hunting dogs during major cases, and he knew it was more than just instinct. John Harper, from the audience, leaned forward. He realized the same thing. His experience as a Marine told him that Shadow wasn't just reacting to Lily, it was reacting to James. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point, like a guitar string pulled to its limit, just waiting for the slightest touch to snap. And that moment, though not yet here, was quietly creeping closer with each passing second. Lily Harper's trembling gesture, her tiny finger pointing directly at James Carver, was like a stone thrown into a still pond, shattering the silence in the Harris County Courthouse. Whispers erupted from the jury and the audience, rolling through the room like waves crashing. A few jurors leaned forward, eyes wide open, while others shook their heads, their expressions filled with doubt. James Carver, from the defendant's table, could no longer maintain his perfect composure. His hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, knuckles turning white, and even though he tried to force a smile, his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic that flashed as quickly as lightning. Judge Daniel Pierce slammed the gavel down on the table, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. Order, he barked, his deep, commanding voice silencing the courtroom instantly. He looked down at Lily, the little girl who had now pulled her hand back, clutching the leash of Shadow as if it were a lifeline. Shadow sat motionless beneath her, but its deep, unwavering eyes were locked onto James. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but he had never witnessed a therapy dog with such a piercing gaze, as if it wasn't just looking but also remembering. Prosecutor Anna Mitchell seized the moment, stepping closer to the jury with newfound confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing clear. Lily Harper's gesture just now was not random. She pointed directly at James Carver, the man whom Mrs. Margaret Evans also identified as being present at the scene on May 15, 2024. "This isn't just emotion, this is a truth." Anna turned to James, her gaze sharp as a knife. "And we will prove that the defendant not only targeted Lily, but is also part of a larger, darker conspiracy." Robert Klein shot up, his voice piercing and nearly out of control. "Your Honor, I request a recess." The plaintiff is trying to manipulate the jury with unverifiable gestures from a 5-year-old child. He pointed at Lily, but his gaze flicked a shadow, as if realizing the dog was a real threat. "And that dog is causing chaos in this courtroom. We need time to reassess the situation." Daniel Pierce leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Klein, you had the chance to contest Shadow's presence, and I've made my ruling. The request for a postponement is denied." He tapped the end of his cane again, but this time it was softer, as if he was pondering something. He glanced at Lily, then down at Shadow, and a thought crossed his mind. This dog wasn't just reacting to Lily. It knew something they hadn't uncovered yet. John Harper, from his seat in the audience, felt the same way. He leaned towards Sarah and whispered, "Did you see the way Shadow looked at Carver? It's not just protecting Lily. It recognizes him." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What do you think, John?" she asked, her voice trembling. John didn't answer right away. He recalled his days in the U.S. Marine Corps when he worked with K-9 dogs at Camp Pendleton. They weren't just trained to sniff out bombs or drugs. They could recognize people even after many years. Shadow had been one of the best dogs in the Houston Police Department before getting injured. Could it have encountered James Carver before? James, from the defendant's table, started to feel the pressure. He leaned over to Robert and whispered something quickly, but his gaze never left Shadow. He never expected the dog to become a problem. In his plan, Lily was a useless witness, a silent little girl who couldn't harm him. But Shadow was different. He remembered that day in Spring Branch when he had to run away because of Mrs. Evans' scream. He hadn't seen any dog there, but now, looking into Shadow's eyes, a chilling doubt rose within him. Anna moved closer to Lily, her voice softer now. "Lily, you did really well. Do you want to take a little break?" The girl didn't respond, but her hands tightened around Shadow's leash. Shadow tilted his head slightly, his nose twitching, and then suddenly stood up. The movement startled everyone in the courtroom. The dog didn't growl or bark, but his body was tense, ears perked up, eyes still locked on James. A murmur rippled through the jury, and this time, Daniel Pierce didn't bang his gavel. He watched quietly, like a hunter waiting for his prey to reveal itself. "Your Honor," Anna said, her voice tinged with surprise, "I believe we just witnessed something very significant. Shadow isn't just a therapy dog. It's reacting to the defendant." She turned to Daniel, her gaze steady. "I suggest we look into Shadow's history with the Houston Police Department. It may have encountered James Carver in another case." Robert Klein shot up again, but before he could say anything, Daniel raised his hand to signal for silence. "Enough," he said, his voice low but heavy with authority. "I'm going to take a 15-minute recess. I want both sides to prepare their next arguments." He tapped the gavel, and the sound this time seemed to mark a turning point. As everyone began to rise, Daniel remained seated, his gaze shifting from Lily to Shadow, then to James. He didn't believe in coincidences, and at that moment, he felt the case was about to explode in a way no one could have anticipated. John stood up, pulling Sarah along with him. He moved closer to the hallway, his gaze fixed on Shadow. "He knows something, Sarah," he whispered, "and I'm going to find out what it is." Sarah nodded, gripping her husband's arm tightly. Inside her, a tiny spark of hope flickered, not just for justice, but because Lily might find herself again through this dog. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Lily remained seated, her hand tightly gripping Shadow. She didn't say a word, but for the first time, her eyes lifted, looking at the dog with absolute trust. Shadow responded by nuzzling against her hand, a gentle gesture amidst the storm. The tension peaked in that moment, but as the trial took a break, the atmosphere began to cool, leaving behind a lingering question. What secret was Shadow hiding, and how would it change everything? The heavy wooden door of the Harris County Courthouse closed behind the last spectators, leaving the courtroom during the 15-minute break announced by Judge Daniel Pierce. The noise of footsteps and hushed whispers gradually faded away, leaving a heavy silence in the vast space. Lily Harper remained seated in the witness chair, her small hands tightly clutching Alicia's Shadow, as it were the last connection she had to the outside world. Shadow, the German shepherd with a long scar along his right flank, stood still beside her, ears perked up, eyes fixed on James Carver without a moment's distraction. Its sudden movement to stand up and tense its body before the recess had sent ripples through the entire room, like a stone thrown into a still pond. John Harper stood in the hallway outside, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his investigator's jacket, his gaze fixed through the small glass window at his daughter. Sarah stood beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched her husband's arm. "What do you think about Shadow, John?" she whispered, her voice choked with tears. John didn't answer right away. He recalled a moment in the courtroom when Shadow stood up, his nose twitching as if he sensed something in the air. As a former Marine who had worked with K-9 dogs at Camp Pendleton, John recognized that look, the gaze of a warrior identifying an enemy. "He's not just protecting Lily," he said slowly, his voice deep. He recognized Carver. "I'm sure of it." In the courtroom, Anna Mitchell stood near the prosecutor's table, holding a cup of water, but not drinking it. She looked at Lily and Shadow, her mind swirling with questions. Shadow's reaction wasn't random. She had seen therapy dogs before, but never one that acted with such certainty. She turned to her assistant, a young guy named Mike, who was quickly flipping through documents. "Mike, can you find Shadow's records from the Houston Police Department?" Anna asked, her voice low but urgent. "I need to know what it's done, who it's met." Mike nodded, hurriedly jotting down notes on his phone. "I'll call HBD right away. If it was AK-9, there's definitely data on it." A few steps away, Lily sat still, her green eyes fixed on the floor. She couldn't hear the conversations around her, but she felt the warmth radiating from Shadow. In the weeks following the attack in Spring Branch, Shadow had become her only source of support. Lily's psychologist, Dr. Laura Bennett, had taught her a special hand signal, a small movement of her index and middle fingers to signal Shadow when she needed help. It was the only way she could speak without uttering a word, a little secret shared between her and the dog. But now, in this courtroom, that signal was about to change everything. At the defendant's table, James Carver sat across from his lawyer, Robert Klein, in a shadowy corner that the audience couldn't see. The smirk that once played on his lips had vanished, replaced by a tense frown. "That dog is the problem," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. Robert tilted his head, his gaze sharp. "What do you mean, James?" "It's just a therapy dog." James shook his head, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "No, you don't understand. I don't know where it came from, but the way it looks at me, it knows something." He paused, his eyes drifting toward Shadow through a crack in the room. He never expected the dog to become a bigger threat than Lily. Daniel Pierce, still seated on the judge's bench, observed everything from a distance. He didn't leave the room as he usually did during breaks. Instead, he remained, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze shifting from Lily to Shadow, then to James. With over 20 years of experience, he had learned how to read the atmosphere, and right now, the air in the courtroom was vibrating like a taut string on a musical instrument. Shadow's reaction was not spontaneous. He recalled an old case from 10 years ago when a K-9 dog had cracked a drug trafficking case just by identifying the suspect's scent. Was Shadow doing something similar? John stepped back into the courtroom, his gaze meeting Daniel's for a brief moment. As a civil investigator, John didn't have the authority to participate directly in the trial, but he couldn't just stand by while his daughter was at the center of it all. He moved closer to Lily, kneeling beside her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle yet filled with concern. Lily didn't respond, but she looked up at her dad, her eyes shining with a rare glimmer of trust. Then, slowly, she reached out, her index and middle fingers twitching in a subtle gesture so slight that almost no one noticed. Shadow reacted instantly. The dog sprang up again, its body taut like an arrow ready to launch. Its ears perked up, its nose twitched, and a low growl rumbled from its throat, not loud, but enough to startle those nearby. Shadow's gaze locked onto James Carver, cutting through the distance like a laser beam. That growl was more than just a sound. It was a warning, a declaration that Shadow had found the one it recognized. Anna turned back. The glass of water in her hand fell to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. "Your Honor!" she shouted, her voice filled with disbelief. Shadow just reacted. It recognized the defendant. Robert Klein jumped up, his face bright red. "This is a circus. The dog can't be a witness." But Daniel Pierce didn't listen to him. He stood up, his eyes narrowed, and in that moment, he knew this trial had just taken an unexpected turn. Tension in the courtroom surged like a raging fire, and Lily's secret signal, small yet powerful, ignited that flame. This was just the beginning. The sound of the glass shattering on the marble floor of the Harris County Courthouse rang out like a gunshot, cutting through Robert Klein's heated objections. Anna Mitchell stood frozen, her gaze shifting from the shards at her feet to Shadow, then to James Carver. The German shepherd remained poised, his body tense, ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat, echoing in the quiet of the break. Lily Harper, seated in the witness stand, pulled her hand back after the secret signal she had just sent, her green eyes wide as she looked at Shadow, as if she too was taken aback by the dog's reaction. But she wasn't afraid. Her small hands gripped the leash tightly, seeking comfort from her loyal companion. Judge Daniel Pierce rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits. He stepped down from the bench, the polished black shoes tapping rhythmically on the floor as he approached Lily and Shadow. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice deep yet commanding, "what did you just say about this dog?" Anna took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure after the unexpected moment. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice still slightly trembling, "Shadow isn't just a therapy dog. It used to be a K-9 for the Houston Police Department. I believe it just recognized James Carver. Such a reaction can't be a coincidence." Robert Klein rushed to the defendant's table, his hands raised as if to stop everything in its tracks. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in 25 years of practice," he shouted, his voice rising to a pitch that was almost a screech. "A dog cannot be a witness. The plaintiff is turning this courtroom into a circus." He turned to James, his eyes pleading for agreement, but James didn't respond. He sat silently, gripping the edge of the table, his gaze darting over the Shadow with an increasingly evident unease. The smirk he usually wore was gone, replaced by a deep furrow in his brow, as if he were trying to recall something important. John Harper, from the corner of the room, stepped closer, his broad shoulders tense beneath his investigator's coat. He knelt beside Lily, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder, but his gaze was locked onto Shadow. As a former U.S. Marine who had worked with K-9 dogs at Camp Pendleton, John recognized that Shadow's stance wasn't an emotional reaction. It was trained instinct, a deep-seated memory from the days it used to chase down criminals. "Lily," he whispered, his voice gentle yet urgent, "what did you just do with your hand?" Lily didn't answer, but she looked at her father, then subtly repeated the signal with her index and middle fingers moving in a small gesture. Shadow reacted again, but this time it was more intense. The dog took a step forward, its nose twitching as if it sensed something in the air, and the growl in its throat grew louder, deeper, a primal sound that made those nearby flinch back. Shadow's gaze pierced through James Carver like a knife, and this time James couldn't hide his panic. He shot up from his seat, his chair toppling backward with a loud crash. "Get that dog away," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear, pointing directly at Shadow. "It has no right to be here." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Robert Klein rushed over, pulling James down into his seat, whispering something urgently into his ear, but James couldn't hear. He was gasping for breath, eyes wide open, his face as pale as if he had just seen a ghost. Daniel Pierce raised his hand for silence, but this time he didn't bang his gavel. He stood there, watching James with a cold curiosity. More than 20 years on the bench had taught him that innocent people don't react this way. Only those with something to hide lose control in the face of an unexpected threat. Anna seized the opportunity and stepped close to Daniel. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steadier than ever. The reactions of Shadow and the defendant just now are clear evidence that something is off. I propose we extend the recess to further investigate Shadow's past. He might have encountered James Carver in an old case that we're not aware of. She turned to James, her gaze sharp. "And if that's the case, we will find out." John stood up, his gaze meeting Anna's for a brief moment. "I can help," he said, his voice deep but steady. "I used to work with K-9 dogs in the Marines. If Shadow recognizes Carver, I know how to track him down." Anna nodded without hesitation. "Thank you, John. We need all the help we can get." Sarah, standing behind, clutched her husband's arm tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, John," she whispered, "help our girl." Daniel Pierce returned to the judge's chair, but he didn't sit down. He looked over at Lily, then at Shadow, and finally at James Carver, who was now trying to regain his composure under Robert's guidance. "The court will take a 30-minute recess," he announced, his voice booming like thunder. "I want both sides to prepare their arguments based on what just transpired. And Ms. Mitchell, I expect you to have answers about this dog when we reconvene." He tapped the gavel, and the sound echoed like a warning that justice was drawing near, and it wouldn't be stopped. As everyone began to leave the room, John knelt down beside Lily once more. "You did great, sweetheart," he said, gently stroking her curly hair. Lily didn't respond, but she looked up at her dad, then at Shadow, and a tiny spark flickered in her eyes as if she understood that the dog was fighting for her. Shadow nuzzled against her hand, a tender gesture amidst the chaos, but its gaze remained fixed on James. James, from the defendant's table, watched Shadow with an unmistakable fear etched on his face. He whispered to Robert, his voice trembling, "If that dog ever sees me, we're dead for sure." Robert tightened his grip on his shoulder, his voice low but fierce. "Shut up, James. I'll handle it." But deep down, both knew that Lily's secret signal had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and the truth was rushing toward them like a tidal wave. The gavel of Judge Daniel Pierce echoed one last time, signaling the 30-minute recess at the Harris County Courthouse. The courtroom gradually emptied, leaving only a few hurried footsteps and anxious whispers from those who lingered. Lily Harper sat quietly in the witness chair, her small hands tightly clutching the leash of Shadow, her emerald green eyes fixed on the floor, as if she were lost in her own world. Shadow, the German shepherd with a long scar along his side, sat beside her, his body still tense, but a growl in his throat had subsided. However, Shadow's gaze remained locked on James Carver, a silent reminder that he had not forgotten. John Harper knelt beside his daughter, his strong hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You can do this, Lily," he said, his voice warm like the nights he used to tell her fairy tales before bed. "I'm proud of you." Lily didn't respond, but she looked up at her dad, then at Shadow, and a tiny, faint smile flickered across her lips like a lantern in the dark. Sarah stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Lily from behind, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank God, she's still here with us," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. John stood up, his gaze meeting Sarah's, and in that moment, they both knew that Shadow was not just a dog. He was their hope. A few steps away, Anna Mitchell picked up the shards of the water glass on the floor, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced over at Daniel Pierce, who was still standing near the judge's bench, his gaze distant as if he were contemplating something monumental. "Your Honor," Anna said, her voice steady, "I will uncover Shadow's past. If it ever encountered Carver, we'll have the evidence to change everything." Daniel nodded slowly, saying nothing, but a spark of determination flickered in his eyes. He turned away, heading to his private office, leaving space for the truth to reveal itself. At the defendant's table, James Carver sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling despite his efforts to clasp them tightly to hide it. Robert Klein stood beside him, his voice low but intense. "You need to calm down, James. We can still control this." James looked up, his eyes wild. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If that dog remembers me, I'm done for." Robert tightened his grip on his shoulder. But inside, a growing doubt gnawed at him. Was his client hiding something? As the courtroom door closed, the heavy atmosphere began to lift, giving way to a silence filled with anticipation. Lily's secret signal had ignited a spark, and Shadow's reaction had turned it into an unstoppable blaze. John looked at Shadow, then at Lily, and within him, a steely resolve surged. He would uncover the truth, not just for justice, but for his little girl. The storm had been foretold, and now it was just waiting for the right moment to erupt. 30 minutes of break at the Harris County Courthouse flew by in the blink of an eye, but the atmosphere in the hallway outside felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. John Harper leaned against the cold brick wall, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his gaze drifting to the small window into the courtroom where Lily and Shadow remained. Sarah sat on a nearby bench, her hands tightly clasped together, her face stained with tears, yet her eyes sparkled with a flicker of fragile hope. Lily's secret signal and Shadow's fierce reaction to James Carver had shaken everything up, and now John knew they were at a turning point, a chance to uncover the truth, not just for Lily, but possibly for other victims as well. Inside the courtroom, Anna Mitchell paced quickly near the prosecutor's table, her hands flipping through the pages that Assistant Mike had just brought in. "This is Shadow's file from the Houston Police Department," Mike said. His voice hurried. He was AK-9 from 2018 to 2022, working in a crime-fighting unit. He was injured during a raid on March 15th, 2022, when he was stabbed by a suspect while protecting an officer. After that, he was retired and moved to a therapy program. Anna paused, her finger pointing to a line. "Who was the suspect in that case?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. Mike turned to the next page, then hesitated. "There's no specific name. The suspect fled before being caught. But there's a description. Male, around 40 years old, 6 feet tall, with brown hair, wearing wire-rimmed glasses." Anna looked up, her eyes meeting John's through the slightly ajar glass door. She waved her hand, signaling for him to come inside. John pushed the door open and stepped in, the sound of his shoes tapping rhythmically on the marble floor. "Did you find something?" he asked, his voice deep but filled with hope. Anna handed him the paper, pointing to the description. "This is the suspect in Shadow case from 3 years ago. Does it sound familiar?" John skimmed through it, then tightened his grip on the paper. "James Carver," he whispered. 6 feet tall, brown hair, wears glasses. He matches the description. As a former Marine who had worked with K-9 dogs, John knew that dogs like Shadow could remember the scent or face of someone they had encountered, even after many years. Lily, sitting in the witness chair, looked up at her dad as he stepped closer. Shadow sat beside her, his head slightly tilted, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. John knelt down, placing his hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, Shadow has tried to tell us something," he said gently. "Do you want to help Dad figure out?" Lily didn't respond, but she gave a slight nod, her hand gently stroking Shadow's fur. The dog nuzzled against her hand, a comforting gesture, but his ears remained perked up, alert and ready. In the hallway, the bell signaling the last 5 minutes of the break rang out. Daniel Pierce stepped out of his private room, the shine of his black shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor as he returned to the judge's bench. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Lily and Shadow, then shifting to James Carver, who sat with his head bowed at the defendant's table, his hands trembling despite his attempts to hide it. Robert Klein stood beside him, whispering something to James, but the tension on his face was evident. He knew that Shadow's reaction had shaken their defense strategy. Anna stepped up to the podium, holding a stack of files. "Your Honor," she said as Daniel took his seat, "during the break, we uncovered crucial information about Shadow. He was a K-9 dog for the Houston Police Department and was injured during a raid 3 years ago. The suspect description from that incident matches James Carver, 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. I recommend allowing further investigation to verify this connection." Her voice rang out with confidence, but inside, she felt her heart racing faster than ever. Robert Klein shot up, his voice piercing the air. "Your Honor, This is baseless speculation. A dog can't testify, and that description is so vague that thousands of people could fit it. He turned to the jury, arms outstretched as if pleading for their agreement. But Daniel Pierce raised his hand for silence, his gaze locked tightly on James. "Mr. Klein, I will determine what is baseless," he said, his voice deep and thunderous. "Ms. Mitchell, please continue." Anna nodded and turned to Lily. "Lily, can you do what you did before?" she asked, her voice gentle. Lily hesitated, then slowly raised her hand, her index and middle fingers subtly moving in the secret signal she had once used. Shadow reacted immediately. The dog stood up, took a step forward, its nose twitching and a low growl rumbled from its throat. Its gaze locked onto James Carver, piercing through the distance like an arrow. James shot up again, his chair toppling backward with a loud crash. "Stop that damn dog!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispers, and this time, Daniel Pierce didn't bang his gavel. He stood there, watching, and deep inside him, a chilling intuition began to rise. Shadow wasn't just recognizing James. It was leading the way to the truth. The sound of James Carver's chair crashing to the marble floor of the Harris County Courthouse echoed like a small explosion, sending the courtroom into chaos. James stood there, his face pale, hands trembling as he pointed directly at Shadow, the German shepherd, who was growling low with a cold, piercing gaze fixed on him. "Get that dog away from me!" he shouted again, his voice cracking, stripped of any trace of the calm he had tried to maintain throughout the trial. Robert Klein rushed over, grabbing James by the shoulders and yanking him down with more force than necessary. "Sit down, James." Robert hissed sharply, his eyes scanning the jury as if assessing the damage from this outburst. Lily Harper, sitting in the witness chair, shrank back at James's shout, her small hands gripping the leash of Shadow so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But Shadow stood firm. The dog took a step forward, its nose twitching as if it sensed something in the air, the growl in its throat growing louder, deeper a sound that instinctively made those nearby step back. Shadow's gaze was not just a warning. It was an accusation, clear and unyielding, as if the dog could see through James's facade to the monster within. Judge Daniel Pierce stood still behind the bench, his eyes narrowed as he observed everything with the calmness of someone who has witnessed too much to be swept away by chaos. He didn't bang his gavel or call for silence. He let the moment unfold on its own, like a scientist watching an experiment reach its critical point. "Ms. Mitchell," he finally spoke, his voice deep yet sharp. "Do you have anything to say about this?" Anna Mitchell took a deep breath, stepping forward to the bench, her hands tightly gripping Shadow's file. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite her heart pounding. Shadow's reaction was not random. He was a K-9 dog for the Houston Police Department, and we believe he encountered James Carver during the raid on March 15th, 2022, the incident where he was injured and the suspect fled. Robert Klein shot up once again, his voice so high-pitched it was almost a screech. "Your Honor, this is a circus. A dog cannot be a witness, and the so-called connection is nothing but speculation. I demand that this entire argument be stricken from the record." He turned to the jury, arms outstretched as if pleading for their agreement, but this time none of them responded. A few leaned forward, their curious eyes locked onto Shadow, while others whispered among themselves, clearly captivated by the unexpected reaction of the dog. John Harper, standing close to Lily, felt a rush of blood to his head. He stepped forward, locking eyes with Anna for a brief moment. "Can I say something, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice low but filled with determination. Daniel Pierce nodded, signaling him to continue. John took a deep breath and turned to the jury. "I am John Harper, Lily's father. I served in the U.S. Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton, working with K-9 dogs for 5 years. Dogs like Shadow are trained to identify suspects by scent, face, even voice, and they never forget. If Shadow reacted to Carver, it wasn't emotion, it was memory." The courtroom was silent, with only the heavy breathing of James Carver echoing from the defendant's table. John turned to look at Shadow, then at James, his gaze sharp as a knife. "I've seen K-9 dogs track down enemies from hundreds of feet away in the dark in Iraq. Shadow isn't growling because he's scared. He's growling because he knows. He paused, letting his words sink in with each juror. Anna seized the moment, stepping closer to John. "Your Honor," she said, "based on Mr. Harper's testimony and Shadow's records, I motion for an urgent investigation to verify the connection between Shadow and James Carver. If we're right, this could change the entire case." Daniel Pierce leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze shifting from John to Shadow, then to James. "Ms. Mitchell," he said slowly, "you have 24 hours to bring concrete evidence of this connection. If not, I will not allow any arguments related to the dog to continue." He tapped the butt of his cane, the sound echoing like a warning. "Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow." James Carver, under Robert's tight grip, sat down, but his hands still trembled. He whispered something to his lawyer, his voice so low that no one could hear except for Robert. "If they find out about that, I'm done for," he said, his eyes wide with panic. Robert tightened his grip on his shoulder, his tone sharp. "Shut up, James. I'll handle it. They have nothing but a dog and a story." But deep down, a growing suspicion gnawed at him. James was hiding something, and Shadow might be the key to unlocking it all. John returned to Lily, kneeling down to hug her. "You did so well, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. Lily didn't respond, but she looked up at her dad, then at Shadow, her hand softly stroking the dog's fur. Shadow nudged his head against her hand, but his gaze remained fixed on James, a silent promise that he wouldn't give up. As everyone began to leave the room, Anna looked at John, her eyes shining with determination. "Mr. Harper, I need you to help me dig deeper into this case," she said. "If Shadow ever met Carver, we have to find evidence in the next 24 hours. John nodded, his gaze burning like a soldier ready for battle. "I'm ready," he said, his voice deep like thunder. The tension in the air reached its peak, and Shadow's reaction had turned it into a dagger piercing through the facade of James Carver, a dagger they would use to uncover the truth. The door of the Harris County Courthouse closed behind the last few people leaving the courtroom, leaving a heavy silence after Judge Daniel Pierce's decision to recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow. John Harper stood in the hallway, his gaze drifting to the small glass window, watching Lily sitting in the witness chair, her hand still tightly clutching Shadow's leash. The German shepherd sat beside her, ears perked up, eyes fixed on the defendant's table, even though James Carver had been hurriedly pulled out by Robert Klein. Sarah stepped forward to hug Lily, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice was a whisper filled with hope. "Sweetheart, everything will be okay," she said, gently stroking the little girl's curly hair. Lily didn't respond, but she nodded slightly, her hands softly petting Shadow, as if seeking comfort. Anna Mitchell stepped into the hallway, holding Shadow's file in her hands, her eyes locking onto John's. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice urgent yet steady, "we have 24 hours to prove that Shadow encountered Carver. You said you could help, and now is when we need you the most." John nodded, his broad shoulders tense beneath his investigator's jacket. "I worked with K9S at Pendleton for 5 years," he said, his voice deep like a vow. "If Shadow recognized Carver from the raid on March 15th, 2022, there will be traces in the Houston Police Department's reports, photos, anything. I know how to find it." Anna offered a faint smile, even though her hands trembled slightly from the pressure. "Let's go," she said, gesturing for him to follow her to the car. On the way to the Houston Police Department, 10 miles east of the courthouse, John sat in the passenger seat, quickly flipping to the file that Anna had handed him. The streetlights flickered across his face, highlighting the rugged features shaped by his years in the U.S. Marine Corps. "Shadow was injured in a raid in the 5th Ward," he read aloud. "The suspect fled, no arrests made. But there's a description. Male, 40 years old, 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing wire-rimmed glasses." He paused, looking at Anna. "Carver is 45 now. 3 years ago, he was about 42. It matches perfectly." Anna tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes lighting up. "If we can find a detailed report or photos from the scene, we could prove that Shadow recognized him." At HBD headquarters, they were led into the storage room by an older officer named Carl, who had worked with the K9 unit a few years back. "Shadow, huh?" Carl said, his voice gravelly, as he rummaged through a dusty drawer. He was one of the best dogs we ever had. The incident in Fifth Ward was a mess. The suspect stabbed him with a dagger and then bolted down an alley before we could surround him. He pulled out an old file and flipped to a page with handwritten notes. Here, Carl pointed to a line. The officer on the scene reported the suspect was wearing a gray jacket, had glasses on, and had a small scar on his left hand. John furrowed his brow, recalling James Carver in the courtroom. "I'm not sure about the scar," he said, "but we need to check his hands." Anna quickly snapped a photo of the document with her phone, then turned to Carl. "Do you have any pictures or sketches of the suspect?" Carl shook his head, looking disappointed. "No, it all happened too fast. We didn't have time to take any." But he paused, digging deeper into the drawer, then pulled out an old tape. This is a recording from the officer on the scene. There's a voice of the suspect yelling something before he ran off. Anna grabbed the tape, her eyes lighting up. If Shadow recognizes the voice, we can use in court. John and Anna left HPD as night fell, carrying a roll of tape and a copy of the report. On the way home, John called Sarah, his voice soft yet urgent. "Take Lily home and let her rest," he said. "Mitchell and I have a lead. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Sarah sighed on the other end of the line, her voice choked with emotion. "Be careful, John. You mean everything to us." John smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. "I promise," he said, then hung up. At Anna's home, 15 miles from downtown Houston, they placed the tape into an old recorder she had kept since college. When they hit the play button, the crackling sound of the radio filled the room, mixed with the screams from the scene of the raid 3 years ago. "Freeze! Hands up!" An officer shouted over the radio, followed by another voice, deep and frantic. "Let me go, you bastard!" John and Anna exchanged glances, their hearts pounding. That voice, though distorted by the tape, carried a familiar tone they had heard in the courtroom. James Carver. John stood up, his hands gripping the armrest tightly. "This is him," he said, his voice as solid as a rock. Shadow recognizes his voice. That's why he growled. Anna nodded, quickly jotting notes in her notebook. "We need Shadow to listen to this recording in front of the jury," she said. "If he reacts like he did today, no one will be able to deny the connection." She glanced at the clock. It was 11 p.m. "We have 10 hours before the trial. Let's take a break, Mr. Harper. Tomorrow morning, we'll shake things up." John sat down on the sofa, his gaze distant. He recalled the days in Iraq when AK-9 Dog had saved his entire team by detecting an enemy hidden in the shadows 200 feet away. Shadow was not just a therapy dog. It was a warrior just like him, and now it was fighting for Lily. The tension of the day peaked with the discovery of the tape, but when Anna turned off the lights, the atmosphere cooled slightly, leaving behind a dramatic anticipation for the morning to come. James Carver, in a temporary cell 5 miles away, lay on the bed, his eyes wide open staring at the ceiling. He knew Shadow was a threat, but he never expected the past to come rushing back so quickly. "You won't win," he whispered to himself, but his voice trembled, and deep down he felt the noose tightening around him. As John and Anna listened to the old tape, James Carver's voice rang out like a beacon cutting through the darkness, bringing them closer to justice. It was a moment when Shadow and their team shone brightly, proving that the truth cannot be hidden forever. Please comment "Awesome Shadow" in the comments to support Team Harper. Each of your comments is a boost for this brave journey. Let's rally together to spread the incredible story of Shadow and the Harper family even further. The first light of dawn broke over the Houston sky, casting soft rays through the window of Anna Mitchell's home as the clock struck 6 a.m. John Harper sat on the sofa, holding a cup of black coffee that Anna had just brewed, his gaze distant yet sharp like a soldier ready for battle. The recording tape from the raid on March 15th, 2022, featuring the panicked voice of the suspect they believed to be James Carver, lay on the table in front of them, next to a file on Shadow from a Houston Police Department. Anna stood near the window, phone in hand, her voice low but urgent as she spoke to Mike, her assistant. "Bring Shadow and Lily to the courthouse by 8. We need them there before the trial starts at 9. John set his coffee cup down, stood up, and walked over to Anna. "Do you think the jury will believe this?" he asked, his voice low but filled with worry. Anna turned to him, her gaze steady. "They don't need to believe that Shadow is a witness," she said. "They just need to see its reaction to Carver's voice on the tape and Carver's reaction when faced with it. That's enough to plant doubt." John nodded slowly, his hand clenched into a fist. As a former Marine who had seen K-9 dogs change the game in life-or-death situations, he knew Shadow had power far beyond that of therapy dog. It was a warrior, and today it would fight for Lily. At the Harper home, 5 miles away, Sarah gently woke Lily. The little girl sat up in bed, her tired green eyes no longer empty like before. Shadow lay beside her, resting his head on her lap, his gaze gentle yet watchful. "Today is a big day, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, lightly stroking Lily's curly hair. "Shadow will be there with you." Lily didn't say a word, but she nodded, her hand softly gripping Shadow's leash as a silent promise. Sarah smiled, even as tears quietly rolled down her cheek. She knew her daughter hadn't found her voice yet, but through Shadow, Lily was beginning to find herself again. At exactly 8 a.m., Lily and Shadow walked into the Harris County Courthouse, followed closely by Sarah and Mike. John and Anna were already waiting in the hallway, next to a small tape recorder they had brought from Anna's house. When Lily spotted her dad, she ran over and wrapped her arms tightly around his leg. John knelt down and pulled her into a warm embrace. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Lily nodded, her little hand still gripping Shadow's leash. The dog stood beside her, his nose twitching slightly, as if sensing the rising tension in the air. The courtroom gradually filled up as the jury and spectators returned at 8:50. James Carver walked in alongside Robert Klein, his face pale, hands trembling despite his effort to clasp them tightly to hide it. He glanced at Shadow, and for a brief moment, his eyes flashed with an unmistakable fear. Daniel Pierce emerged from his private chamber, took his seat on the bench, and his eyes scanned the room before landing on Anna. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice deep, "you have 24 hours to bring forth evidence. I hope you're prepared." Anna stepped up to the podium, holding a tape. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice ringing clear. "We have found a recording from the raid on March 15th, 2022, when Shadow, who was in the K-9 of the Houston Police Department, was severely injured by the suspect. The description of the suspect matches James Carver, 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, around 40 years old at time." She raised the tape. "This is the suspect's voice from the scene. I propose we play it right now, with Shadow present, to establish the connection." Robert Klein shot up, his voice piercing. "Your Honor, this is a scam. A 3-year-old tape proves nothing." But Daniel Pierce raised his hand for silence. "I want to hear it," he said, his gaze sharp. "Go ahead, Ms. Mitchell." Anna nodded, placed the tape into the recorder, and hit play. The crackling sound of the radio filled the air, mixed with screams from the scene. "Stay still, hands up." An officer shouted over the radio, followed by the deep, panicked voice of the suspect. "Let me go, you bastards." Shadow reacted instantly. The dog sprang to its feet, body tense, nose twitching, and a deep growl rumbled from its throat. Its gaze locked onto James Carver, cutting through the distance like a knife. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and James shot up, his chair toppling over with a loud crash. "Shut it off," he yelled, his voice trembling with panic, pointing at the recorder. "Turn it off now." Robert Klein rushed over to pull James down, but it was too late. The jury stared intently, some of their mouths agape, while others whispered among themselves. John stood next to Lily, gripping her shoulder tightly, his eyes blazing. He knew Shadow had just confirmed what they had suspected. Anna turned to Daniel, her voice trembling with excitement. "Your Honor, Shadow's reaction and the defendant's own response are undeniable evidence. James Carver is the prime suspect in that raid, and if he did this to Shadow, who knows what he's done to other victims." Daniel Pierce struck the gavel, the sound echoing through the room and bringing everyone to silence. "Enough," he said, his voice deep yet commanding. "I will give the prosecution 48 more hours to dig deeper based on this evidence. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. the day after tomorrow." He turned to James, his gaze as cold as ice. "Mr. Carver, I suggest you brace yourself." As everyone left the room, John knelt beside Lily, holding her tighter than ever. "You did it, sweetheart," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Lily looked up, and for the first time in months, she smiled a small but radiant smile. Shadow nuzzled against her hand, his gaze gentle yet unwavering. Sarah rushed over, wrapping her arms around both of them, her tears now tears of joy. James Carver, pulled out of the room by Robert, turned back to look at Shadow one last time, his eyes wild. He knew his facade had shattered, and Shadow, the dog he never expected, was the one who had destroyed everything. The tension peaked with his scream, but as the trial took a break, the atmosphere cooled down, leaving a bright glimmer of hope for the Harper family and a promise that the truth would soon be revealed. The sun had just risen over the Houston horizon as John Harper's truck turned into the parking lot of the Harris County Courthouse at 7 a.m., just 2 hours before the trial resumed on the third day, March 21st, 2025. The 48-hour recess that Judge Daniel Pierce had granted the plaintiff to dig deeper into the connection between Shadow and James Carver was now down to the final minutes, and John knew that everything hinged on what they would uncover today. He stepped out of the driver's seat, his dusty shoes tapping rhythmically on the pavement, his sharp gaze scanning the parking lot where Anna Mitchell was waiting, holding a cup of coffee and a thick file from the Houston Police Department. Sarah sat in the back seat, holding Lily tightly, while the little girl clutched Shadow's leash like it was a lifeline. The German shepherd stepped out of the car, its nose twitching, ears perked up like radar, its gaze deep and alert. Shadow's intense reaction to the recording of James Carver from yesterday, March 19th, had shaken the courtroom, and now John felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. Reminiscent of the days he prepared for a dangerous mission at Camp Pendleton in the U.S. Marine Corps. "Do we have any updates, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Anna handed the remaining cup of coffee to John, her eyes lighting up even though her hands trembled slightly from lack of sleep. "I contacted a former officer from HBD last night," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "He remembers a raid on March 15th, 2022, in the 5th Ward, where Shadow got hurt. The suspect, we believe, is Carver ran through an alley, but he mentioned a clue that was overlooked. A black truck spotted near the scene, about 500 feet away. No one investigated at the time, because the situation was too chaotic." She flipped through the file, pointing to a handwritten note. "And guess what? James Carver owns a black truck, registered in his name since 2021. John tightened his grip on the coffee cup, his eyes narrowing. "If we can prove that car was near 5th Ward that day, along with Shadow's reaction, we can pin Carver to the raid," he said. "But we need more evidence, something more concrete than a note." Anna nodded, pointing toward Shadow. "That's why I want to bring him along. If Carver left any traces from the other jobs, Shadow might be able to sniff them out. I've already requested a search warrant for his house and any property registered in his name within a 20-mile radius of Houston." Sarah stepped forward, and Lily pressed close to her, her eyes filled with worry yet determination. "John, are you sure this is safe?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want Lily to be in danger anymore." John turned around, placing his hand on his wife's shoulder, his gaze gentle yet firm. "I promise, Sarah. Shadow, and I won't let anything happen to her. But we have to do this for Lily, and for anyone else that Carver has hurt." Sarah nodded, hugging Lily tighter, and the little girl looked up at her dad, her green eyes shining with a flicker of trust. An hour later, at 8 a.m., John, Anna, and Shadow stood in front of an old wooden house located 15 miles from downtown Houston, near the edge of Sam Houston National Forest, a property registered to James Carver that they had found through tax records. The house looked abandoned, with dusty windows and a front yard overgrown with weeds, but a black pickup truck parked under the shade of an oak tree 50 feet away made John's heart race. "That's it," he whispered, his gaze locked on the vehicle. Anna checked the search warrant in her hand and nodded to the 2 HBD officers accompanying them. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. As they moved forward, Shadow suddenly tensed up, his nose twitching, ears perked up higher than ever. The dog rushed toward the house, pulling on the leash that John was holding, and a low growl rumbled from his throat, not loud, but enough to make the whole group freeze. "He's sniffing something out," John said, his voice low but urgent. He recalled the days in Iraq when AK-9 had detected a bomb from 300 feet away just by scent. Shadow wasn't just reacting to Carver in the courtroom. He was leading them to something much bigger. The lead officer, a tall man named Ramirez, nodded at John and signaled for the team to move in. They pushed open the unlocked front door and stepped into the dark space, filled with the musty smell of dampness and rotting wood. Inside, the house was empty, with just an old table, a few empty cans, and a filthy rug. But Shadow didn't stop. The dog pulled John toward the back wall, where the wooden floor had an unusual crack. "What is this?" Anna whispered, bending down to touch the crack. John knelt, tapping lightly on the floor, the hollow sound echoing back. "There's something underneath," he said, his eyes lighting up. Ramirez pulled a metal rod from his belt and pried the floorboard up, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Shadow growled louder, its body trembling with tension, eyes fixed on the dark space below. John looked at Anna, his heart pounding. "We just found something," he said, his voice deep like thunder. The tension in the air skyrocketed, like a string pulled taut to its breaking point, and the journey to uncover the truth was just beginning. The light from Officer Ramirez's flashlight cut through the thick darkness of the narrow staircase, leading down to the secret basement in the wooden house near Sam Houston National Forest. John Harper stepped down first, gripping the leash of Shadow, the German shepherd, whose body was tense, a low growl rumbling in its throat echoing in the cramped space. Each of John's footsteps on the old wooden stairs creaked ominously, like a drumbeat signaling that something terrifying was about to be revealed. Anna Mitchell followed closely behind, holding a second flashlight, its flickering beam illuminating the damp, moldy walls covered in cobwebs. Ramirez and another officer, named Lopez, brought up the rear, their hands poised on their holsters, eyes alert and watchful. The air in the basement was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint, fishy odor that made John grimace. He recalled his days in Iraq, when he and his Marine Corps team used to search enemy bunkers 20 feet below ground. The instincts of a veteran told him that this place was not just an empty cellar. It was a grave waiting to be unearthed. Shadow tugged hard on the rope, pulling John toward the farthest corner of the basement, where the beam of the flashlight illuminated a pile of scattered items on the dirt floor. A tiny pair of children's shoes, a tattered doll, and a faded pink backpack. Anna stepped forward, her flashlight trembling as it illuminated the items. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "These are children's things." She knelt down, her hand shaking as she touched the backpack, then looked up at John. "What do you think? Could this be—" She didn't finish her sentence, but her eyes conveyed all the fear that they had just uncovered evidence of crimes far beyond Lily Harper's botched kidnapping. John nodded slowly, his gaze locked onto Shadow. "It smells something," he said, his voice deep like thunder. "We're not done yet." The Shadow suddenly growled louder, its body trembling as its gaze fixated on a darker corner of the basement. John raised his flashlight, and the beam illuminated a small figure huddled in the corner, a little girl, about 8 years old, with matted hair and thin arms tightly wrapped around her knees. A chain was wrapped around her ankle, connecting to a metal ring firmly anchored to the wall. "Sophie," Anna shouted, recognizing the pale face of Sophie Bennett, a missing girl from 6 months ago that her team had been investigating. She rushed forward, but John held up his hand to stop her. "Let me," he said, his voice steady. John knelt down in front of Sophie, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft like when he spoke to Lily. Sophie looked up, her eyes clouded with fear and exhaustion. But when she saw Shadow, a spark of light flickered in her gaze. "Dog," she whispered, her voice hoarse from not being used for so long. Shadow stepped forward, nuzzling against Sophie's hand, and she clutched its fur as if holding onto a glimmer of hope. Ramirez rushed in, using bolt cutters to snap the chain, the sound of metal breaking echoing through the basement. "We've got the girl," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Anna stood up, her hands clutching her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The little girl is alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh God, Sophie is alive." She turned to John, her eyes shining bright. Shadow found her. If it hadn't led us here. She didn't finish her thought, but John understood. He stood up, wrapping his arms around Sophie, feeling her tiny body trembling in his embrace. "You're safe now," he said, his voice warm and soothing. "We're going to take you home." Lopez stepped forward, holding the radio. "I'm calling for rescue," he said, his voice urgent. "We need a doctor right away." He pressed a button, and his voice crackled to the radio waves. "This is Officer Lopez. We found Sophie Bennett, 8 years old, in a basement near Sam Houston National Forest. Send a medical team immediately, 15 miles north of Houston." A static-filled response came back, confirming that the rescue team would arrive in 20 minutes. But John knew they couldn't wait long. Sophie needed to be out of there immediately. John picked Sophie up, his strong arms cradling her gently like a fragile leaf. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. Shadow led the way up the stairs, its growl replaced by a watchful silence. Anna followed closely behind, holding a flashlight to illuminate the path, while Ramirez and Lopez quickly scanned the basement for any additional clues. As they stepped out of the house, the early sunlight bathed Sophie's pale face, and she shut her eyes as if the light was a stranger after 6 months in the dark. John set Sophie down on the grass outside, kneeling beside her as Anna grabbed a bottle of water from the car. "Take small sips, sweetheart," she said, handing the bottle to Sophie. The little girl drank slowly, her hands trembling, but her eyes began to brighten. Shadow lay next to her, resting his head on Sophie's lap, his gaze gentle yet unwavering. John looked at the dog, then at Anna, his heart pounding. "This isn't just about Lily anymore," he said, his voice low. "How many other kids has Carver done this to?" Anna nodded, gripping the water bottle tightly. "We have to get back to the courthouse right now," she said. "Sophie is a living witness. She can identify Carver in front of the jury." She glanced at the clock, 8:30 a.m. "We have 30 minutes before the trial starts. The rescue team will take care of Sophie, but we need to be there with this evidence." John stood up, his eyes blazing like a soldier ready for battle. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm and resolute. The tension in the air reached a breaking point when they found Sophie, but as the rescue team appeared in the distance with their blaring sirens, a glimmer of hope shone through the storm. The journey to uncover the truth had achieved an unexpected victory, and the final showdown with James Carver was closer than ever. Can you feel the heartstrings tugging when Shadow finds Sophie? A dog, a ray of hope, changed everything. If this story of loyalty and courage resonates with you, please like and subscribe to the Legendary Narratives channel so we can share beautiful moments like this with everyone. Thank you. The sound of a tow truck siren pierced the still air of the land near Sam Houston National Forest as John Harper knelt beside Sophie Bennett, the 8-year-old girl just rescued from the dark basement. The early sunlight illuminated Sophie's pale face, highlighting her exhausted, cloudy eyes, yet she clung tightly to Shadow, the German shepherd lying beside her like a silent guardian. Anna Mitchell stood nearby, holding a water bottle, her gaze flickering between Sophie and the black truck parked under the oak tree about 50 feet away, a vivid reminder connecting James Carver to this horrific crime. Ramirez and Lopez, 2 HBD officers, remained inside the house, searching every nook and cranny for more clues before the rescue team arrived. John stood up, his gaze sweeping over the desolate land, his heart pounding in his chest. He recalled the days in Iraq when he and his Marine Corps team had found civilians trapped in deep 30-foot underground bunkers, memories he thought were buried, now revived through Sophie's eyes. "She needs a doctor right away," he said, his voice low but urgent, turning to Anna. "But we also need to get her statement before we take her to court. If Sophie recognizes Carver, we could wrap this up today." Anna nodded, kneeling beside Sophie, her voice gentle yet careful. "Sophie, I'm Anna, a lawyer. Do you remember who brought you here?" The little girl looked up, her cracked lips moving slightly, but no sound escaped. Shadow nuzzled against Sophie's hand, and she clutched it for tighter, as if seeking strength. "A man," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse like the wind through sand. "He had glasses, the deep voice, he talked about puppies." Anna and John exchanged glances, their hearts racing. That description matched James Carver perfectly, and the lure he had used on Lily Harper in Spring Branch 10 months ago. Ramirez stepped out of the house, holding a plastic bag containing a few small items: a beaded bracelet, a crumpled piece of paper, and a faded Polaroid photo. "We found these under the basement floor," he said, his voice tense. The photo is of another girl, not Sophie. He handed the picture to Anna, and she gasped as she saw a stranger's face, a girl about 6 years old with blonde hair, smiling brightly next to a doll. "Oh my God!" Anna whispered, her hands trembling. He didn't stop with Sophie or Lily. "How many more kids are there?" John clenched his fist tightly, his eyes blazing with intensity. "We need to check the truck," he said, his voice as firm as a rock. He strode quickly toward the black truck, with Shadow trailing behind, his nose twitching as if picking up on something. Anna and Ramirez hurried after them, while Lopez stayed back with Sophie, grabbing more water from the police car. John opened the unlocked back door of the truck, and a musty smell mixed with metallic stench hit him hard. Inside, the floor was stained with splotches, and an old coil of rope lay discarded in the corner. Shadow growled louder, his body tense, his gaze fixed intently on the floor of the truck. Anna raised her flashlight, the beam illuminating a small crack in the metal floor. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. John knelt down, using the dagger from his belt to pry the floor panel up. Beneath it was a hidden compartment, and as the light shone in, both of them fell silent. Another pair of children's shoes, a torn sweater, and a silver necklace engraved with the name Emma. "Emma Sullivan," Anna whispered, her voice choked. "The girl who went missing 18 months ago in Pasadena, just 15 miles from Houston. We thought she couldn't finish her sentence, tears streaming down her cheeks." John stood up, gripping the dagger tightly, his eyes darkening. "Carver isn't just a kidnapper," he said, his voice deep like thunder. "He's a monster, and Shadow knows it." The dog growled again, stepping forward as if ready to charge at something invisible. John turned to Anna, his gaze resolute. "We have enough to take him to court right now, Sophie. The car, these items. But if there are more victims, we need to find them before it's too late." The sound of the rescue vehicle's siren grew closer, just a mile away, and Ramirez burst out of the house, radio in hand. "The medical team will be here in 5 minutes," he shouted. "They're bringing a doctor and social workers." Anna nodded, turning back to Sophie, kneeling down once more. "Sophie, do you remember anything else about the man? Anything that could help us?" The little girl closed her eyes, gripping Shadow for tightly, then whispered, "He had a bag black for his stuff." Anna looked at John, her eyes lighting up. That bag could be here or at the Carver's main house. John returned to the truck, quickly searching the corners, but found no bag. "It's not here," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to search his house in Houston right away." He glanced at his watch, 8:45 a.m. "We have 15 minutes before the trial starts. If the rescue team gets here in time, we can hand Sophie over to them and rush back to court." Anna nodded, jotting down notes rapidly in her notebook. "I'll call for more officers to head to the Carver house. If that bag really exists, it could hold the evidence that takes him down." The rescue vehicle appeared from the dirt road, dust swirling in the air as it came to a stop about 100 feet away from them. The medical staff rushed out, carrying a stretcher and first aid bags, and John lifted Sophie onto the stretcher. "Take good care of her," he said to the doctor, his voice deep yet commanding. Sophie looked at Shadow, her hand reaching out, and the dog nuzzled against her hand one last time before she was loaded into the vehicle. Anna turned to John, her eyes blazing. "Let's go," she said. "We're going to make Carver pay." The tension in the air reached a boiling point with the horrifying discoveries in the truck. But when Sophie was handed over to the rescue team, a small glimmer of hope flickered as they drew closer to the truth, and James Carver had nowhere left to run. The sound of the tow truck siren faded as the vehicle carrying Sophie Bennett sped toward the hospital, 15 miles away from Sam Houston National Forest, leaving John Harper, Anna Mitchell, and Shadow standing by the old wooden house at 8:50 a.m. on March 21st, 2025. John watched the truck disappear down the dirt road, gripping Shadow's leash tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. Discovering that Sophie was alive after 6 months of captivity was an unexpected victory, But the items in James Carver's black truck, her shoes, a sweater, a necklace engraved with the name Emma, were like ghosts reminding him that the story wasn't over yet. Anna stood beside him, phone in hand, her voice urgent as she contacted the HBD team. "I need you to get to James Carver's house in Spring Branch right now," she said. "Look for a black bag that could hold evidence. We'll be at the courthouse in 10 minutes. John turned to Anna, his gaze sharp as a knife. "We don't have time to search his house before the trial," he said, his voice low but tense. "The trial starts at 9 a.m., and we've got just 10 minutes left. Sophie is a living witness, and the stuff in the truck is enough to pin Carver down right now." Anna nodded, quickly jotting notes in her notebook. "You're right," she said. "But if the bag Sophie mentioned really exists, it could hold DNA or clues about other victims like Emma Sullivan. I've sent the HBD team to retrieve it. We'll use what we have to take Carver down today, and then we can fill in the gaps later." She glanced at her watch, her heart racing. "Let's go." They jumped into John's truck, with Shadow leaping into back seat, his nose twitching as if he was still sniffing something in the air. John hit the gas, the truck roaring toward the Harris County Courthouse, 15 miles away, dust flying up behind them. On the way, Anna opened the file, her voice cutting through the roar of the engine. "We have Sophie identifying Carver by his steel-rimmed glasses, his deep voice, and his tempting talk about puppies," she said. "We have Shadow reacting to his voice on the recording from the raid on March 15th, 2022. And now, we have physical evidence from the truck Emma's belongings and those of the other kids. This is a case that can't be denied." John nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But Carver won't plead guilty easily," he said. "He'll fight tooth and nail." They arrived at the courthouse at 8:58 a.m., the car screeching to a halt right in front of the main entrance. Sarah stood at the entrance, holding Lily tightly in her arms, her eyes filled with worry but lighting up when she saw John and Anna step out. "How's Sophie?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. John knelt beside Lily, wrapping her in a warm embrace before answering. "She's alive, Sarah," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "Shadow found her, and we're going to make Carver pay." Lily looked up, her hand gently stroking Shadow's fur, and for the first time in months, she smiled a small but radiant smile, like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. The courtroom was packed as they entered at 9 a.m. James Carver sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, hands tightly clasped but unable to hide his trembling. Robert Klein stood beside him, whispering something to him, his eyes tense like a man who knows he's losing. Daniel Pierce stepped out from his chambers, took his seat on the bench, and his gaze swept across the room before landing on Anna. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice deep, "your 48 hours are up. I hope you have something worthwhile to present." Anna stepped up to the podium, holding a file and a plastic bag containing evidence from the truck. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice ringing clear. "In the past 48 hours, we have found Sophie Bennett, an 8-year-old girl, imprisoned in a basement near Sam Houston National Forest on property registered to James Carver. The girl identified the defendant by his steel-framed glasses, his deep voice, and his enticing words about puppies, just like he approached Lily Harper on May 15th, 2024. She raised the plastic bag. "We also found these items in Carver's truck. A pair of shoes, a sweater, and a necklace engraved with the name Emma Sullivan, the little girl who went missing 18 months ago in Pasadena." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the jury staring intently at the plastic bag, some covering their mouths in shock. Robert Klein sprang to his feet, his voice piercing the tension. "Your Honor, this is surprise evidence. We weren't notified to prepare a rebuttal." But Daniel Pierce raised his hand for silence, his gaze as cold as ice. "Mr. Klein, you will have your chance to respond," he said. "But I want to hear everything. Go ahead, Ms. Mitchell." Anna turned to Shadow, who was standing next to Lily in the audience. "Shadow led us to the basement," she said. "He used to be a K-9 dog for the HBD, injured during a raid on March 15th, 2022, by a suspect matching Carver's description. His reaction to Carver's voice on the tape yesterday, and today in the basement, is living proof that James Carver isn't just targeting Lily, he's a serial kidnapper." She pointed at James, her voice trembling with anger. He kept Sophie for 6 months, and who knows how many other kids have suffered because of him. James shot up, slamming his hands down on the table. "I don't know anything about that basement," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Someone set me up." Robert tried to pull him back down, but it was too late. The jury had already witnessed his loss of control. Shadow growled low from the audience seats. His gaze locked onto James, and that growl felt like a knife piercing through his facade. John stood next to Lily, his hand gripping her shoulder tightly, his eyes blazing. He looked at Anna and nodded slightly, like a soldier confirming that his comrade had hit the target. Daniel Pierce struck the butt of his gavel, the sound echoing through the room, silencing everyone. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice deep like thunder. "The court will take a 1-hour recess for the defense to prepare their rebuttal. But I warn you, Mr. Klein, this evidence is quite substantial." He turned to James, his gaze sharp as a knife. "Mr. Carver, you should pray for a miracle." As everyone left the room, John embraced Lily and Sarah, feeling the warmth of family amidst the storm. The tension peaked with Anna's accusations and James's panic. But the break offered a brief moment of peace, a glimmer of hope that justice was on the horizon. The hallway of the Harris County Courthouse was thick with tension as the 1-hour recess declared by Judge Daniel Pierce began at 10 a.m. on March 21st, 2025. John Harper sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, holding Lily tightly. The little girl nestled against her with the leash for Shadow gripped firmly in her hand. Shadow lay at their feet, ears perked up, his deep gaze scanning the hallway as if he remained alert even during the break in the trial. Sarah sat beside him, her hand clasped in John's, her eyes flickering between worry and hope. The strong accusations from Anna Mitchell against survivor Sophie Bennett, the items found in James Carver's truck, and Shadow's reactions had shaken the courtroom, but John knew the battle was far from over. Robert Klein wouldn't give up easily. Anna stepped out from a corner of the hallway, phone in hand, her voice urgent as she spoke to Officer Ramirez on the line. "Have you found the black bag yet?" she asked, her eyes lighting up at the response. "Great. Bring it here right away. We have 45 minutes before the trial resumes." She hung up, turning to John with a rare smile. "The HBD team just searched the Carver house in Spring Branch," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "They found a black bag in the basement containing children's clothes, a notebook, and a few Polaroid photos. One of them is of Sophie before she was taken." John tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, his gaze burning with intensity. "He documented everything," he said, his voice deep and thunderous. "Now there's no way out." Sarah looked at Anna, her voice trembling. "What about the other kids? Emma Sullivan and the others?" Anna sighed, brushing her hair back. "The notebook might give us the answers," she said. "But first, we need to take down Carver today. Sophie will be brought here from the hospital as soon as the doctor gives the go-ahead, which could be in a few hours. With her testimony, the evidence from the bag, and Shadow, he won't be able to deny it." She glanced at Shadow, her expression softening. This dog didn't just save Lily, he saved Sophie too, and maybe even more people. John stood up, his gaze distant as he recalled the days of Pendleton, where he had seen K9 dogs sniff out enemies from 300 feet away in the dark. "Shadow is a warrior," he said, his voice warm and deep. "He never gives up, just like us." He knelt beside Lily, gently stroking her curly hair. "You see, sweetheart, Shadow is fighting for you and Sophie. We're going to win." Lily didn't say anything, but she nodded, her hand brushing Shadow's fur, and a small spark flickered in her eyes, a sign that she was slowly coming back. In the defendant's private room, James Carver sat across from Robert Klein, his hands trembling tightly on the table. "What did they find in my house?" he asked, his voice wavering with panic. Robert frowned, his expression tense. "HBD just called," he said, his tone low but sharp. "They have a black bag of clothes, photos, and a notebook. If that's what I think it is, James, you've been hiding too much from me." James shot up, slamming his hands down on the table. "I don't know anything about that bag," he shouted, but his eyes flickered, and Robert knew he was lying. "Sit down," Robert snapped, his voice icy. "I'll try to deny your connection to the basement and the bag, but if Sophie identifies you, we're done for." The hallway gradually filled up as the clock struck 10:45 a.m., signaling the last 15 minutes of the break. Anna received the plastic bag containing evidence from Ramirez, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside, a grimy black notebook revealed scrawled lines, dates, names, and a brief description. Sophie, 8, brown hair, September 15th, 2024. Emma, 6, blonde hair, September 15th, 2023. Anna read aloud, her voice choked with emotion. "He's making a list of victims," she said, her hands shaking as she handed the notebook to John. "Emma went missing 18 months ago. She couldn't finish her sentence, tears streaming down her cheeks." John flipped through the notebook, his expression darkening as he saw dozens of names whose fates he didn't know. "How many years has he been doing this?" he whispered, gripping the notebook tightly. Anna wiped away her tears, her voice steady once more. "We'll find them one by one, but today we end him first." She glanced at the clock, 10:55 a.m. "Let's go," she said, signaling for John and the Harper family to enter the courtroom. The courtroom was packed as Daniel Pierce returned to stand at 11 a.m. James Carver walked in, his face pale, his wild eyes darting towards Shadow, who was standing next to Lily in the spectators' row. Anna stepped up to the stand, holding a notebook and a plastic bag. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing clear. "We have just received additional evidence in the Carver residence, a black bag containing clothing, photographs, and a notebook listing the names of the victims, including Sophie Bennett and Emma Sullivan. This is undeniable evidence that the defendant is a serial kidnapper." Robert Klein shot up, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, we weren't informed about this evidence." But Daniel Pierce raised his hand, his gaze as cold as ice. "Mr. Klein, I gave you an hour to prepare," he said. "Sit down." He turned to Anna. "Go ahead, Ms. Mitchell." Anna held up her notebook, her voice shaking with anger. "James Carver didn't just target Lily Harper. He has kidnapped and held many children for years, and we will find every last victim." James shot up again, slamming his hands on the table. "I didn't do anything," he yelled, but his voice trailed off, and Shadow growled from the audience seats, his gaze locked onto him. The jury stared intently, and this time there was no doubt left. Daniel Pierce tapped the end of his gavel, the sound echoing in the tense air. "That's enough," he said. "The court will recess until 1 p.m. to review the new evidence. But I warn you, Mr. Carver, your time is running out." John hugged Lily and Sarah, feeling the warmth of family amidst the storm. The tension peaked with the notebook and James's panic, but the break brought a moment of peace. Justice was drawing near, and the journey to uncover the truth laid the groundwork for ultimate victory. The doors of the Harris County Courthouse swung open at 1 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, as the bell signaling the end of the break rang out, pulling everyone back into the courtroom after a tense pause. John Harper walked in with Sarah and Lily, his hand tightly gripping his daughter's, feeling her tiny fingers trembling yet warm in his palm. Shadow, the German shepherd with a long scar along his side, trotted beside Lily, his ears perked up, his deep gaze sweeping across the room like a vigilant guard that never rests. The discovery of the black notebook in James Carver's home, containing a list of victims, including Sophie Bennett and Emma Sullivan, along with Sophie's preliminary testimony from the hospital, had shaken everything, and John knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension like a storm about to break. The jury sat in silence, their eyes flickering between curiosity and horror after the evidence presented before the break. Anna Mitchell stood near the prosecutor's table, clutching a black notebook and a plastic bag containing clothes, Polaroid photos, and other pieces of evidence from the Carver home. She wore a dark blue suit, her blonde hair neatly tied back, but her hands trembled slightly as she prepared for the final confrontation. Sarah sat next to John in the spectators' row, her hand gripping her husband's tightly. Her gaze filled with a mix of hope and anxiety. "Do you think this will end today?" she whispered, her voice shaking. John nodded, his eyes fixed on Lily. "It has to end," he said, his tone deep. "For her." Daniel Pierce stepped out of his private chamber, the polished black shoes tapping rhythmically on the floor as he took his seat on the bench. His gaze swept across the room, landing on James Carver at the defendant's table. James sat there, his face pale, hands tightly clasped but unable to hide the tremor. Robert Klein stood beside him, his expression tense, like a man who knows he's teetering on the edge of defeat. "Ms. Mitchell," Daniel said, his voice deep yet sharp, "before we break for recess, you presented new evidence. I want to hear the rest. Proceed." Anna stepped up to the podium, holding the black notebook high. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice ringing clear even though her heart was pounding. "We found this notebook in James Carver's home in Spring Branch, 5 miles away. Inside is a list of victims' children who have been kidnapped over the years, including Sophie Bennett, who was rescued this morning after being held captive for 6 months in a basement near Sam Houston National Forest, and Emma Sullivan, who went missing 18 months ago in Pasadena." She flipped through the notebook, reading aloud a scrawled line. "Sophie, 8 brown hair, September 15th, 2024, the day she was taken. This is no coincidence. This is evidence of a serial kidnapper." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the jury staring intently at the notebook, some covering their mouths in shock. Robert Klein shot up, his voice piercing the tension. "Your Honor, we don't have time to verify this notebook. It could be a forgery." But Daniel Pierce raised his hand, his gaze icy. "Mr. Klein, you've had an hour to prepare," he said. "Sit down. I want to hear everything." Robert sat back down, his face flushed. But James didn't react. He simply bowed his head, his hands trembling even more violently. Anna turned to the jury, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and emotion. "Sophie Bennett, 8 years old, was rescued thanks to Shadow, the dog who was once a K-9 for the Houston Police Department, who was stabbed by Carver during the raid on March 15th, 2022. Sophie identified him by his wire-rimmed glasses, his deep voice, and the way he lured her in with promises of puppies, just like he approached Lily Harper on May 15th, 2024. She held up a plastic bag. "In Carver's truck, we found belongings of Emma Sullivan and other victims. This is not just a single kidnapping. This is a long-running criminal operation." John tightened his grip on Lily's hand, feeling her warmth amidst the storm of emotions. He recalled the moment Shadow growled at Carver, the instant they found Sophie, and now the black notebook felt like a final dagger piercing through his armor. Sarah whispered, "Oh, God, how many more kids?" John didn't respond, but his gaze darkened. He knew this fight wasn't just for Lily or Sophie, but for all the nameless victims in that notebook. Anna set the notebook down and turned to Daniel. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we have an additional witness, Sophie Bennett. She is being brought here from the hospital and is expected to arrive in 30 minutes. With the court's permission, I suggest we wait for Sophie so she can identify the defendant in front of the jury." Daniel leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, are you sure the girl is healthy enough to do this?" he asked, his tone low but concerned. Anna nodded. "The doctor said she's stable but weak, yet alert enough to make an identification. This is our chance to wrap up the case." Robert Klein shot up once again. "Your Honor, this isn't fair. An 8-year-old child who just experienced trauma can't be a reliable witness." But Daniel raised his hand, his gaze sharp as a knife. "I will decide what is reliable," he said. "The court will take a 45-minute recess to wait for Sophie Bennett. I want everything ready when she arrives." He struck the gavel, the sound echoing like a declaration that justice was approaching and nothing could stand in its way. John held Lily tighter, feeling her steady breath. The tension in the courtroom surged with the notebook and the promise of Sophie's testimony, like an unquenchable fire blazing away. But as the break began, a small glimmer of hope flickered. The moment of the ultimate confrontation was approaching, and James Carver had nowhere left to hide. The hallway of the Harris County Courthouse was thick with tension as the clock struck 1:15 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, marking 15 minutes into a 45-minute break that Judge Daniel Pierce had called to wait for Sophie Bennett to arrive from the hospital. John Harper leaned against the cold brick wall, his gaze distant yet sharp, like a seasoned Marine preparing for the final battle. Lily sat on a nearby bench, gripping the leash of Shadow, the German shepherd lying beside her, ears perked up, eyes fixed on the courthouse entrance. Sarah stood next to John, her hand tightly clasping her husband's, her voice a whisper filled with worry. Is Sophie going to be okay, John? She's only 8 years old. John turned to his wife, placing a hand on her shoulder, his gaze gentle yet firm. She survived 6 months in hell, he said, his voice warm. If Shadow finds her, then she's strong enough to face Carver today. We have to believe that. Sarah nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she managed a weak smile, drawing strength from the man who had led his team to the darkest nights in Iraq a decade ago. Shadow looked up at Lily, nuzzling against her hand, as if to say that it believed not only in Sophie but in Lily herself. Anna Mitchell hurried down the hallway, phone in hand, her voice urgent as she spoke to Officer Ramirez on the line. "Where's Sophie?" she asked, her eyes lighting up as she heard the response. "Great. Get her in as soon as she arrives. We have 25 minutes left." She hung up, turning to John with a rare glimmer of hope. "Sophie just left the hospital 5 miles away," she said. "The doctor said she's weak but alert. They'll be here in 15 minutes. We'll have her in front of the jury right on time." John nodded, his hands clenched into fists. "Today we'll end it," he said, his voice as solid as a rock. In the defendant's private room, James Carver sat across from Robert Klein, his hands trembling tightly on the table, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. "Sophie Bennett is alive?" he whispered, his voice shaky with panic. "They can't let her speak. It will ruin me." Robert frowned, his gaze as cold as ice. "James, what did you tell me about that basement?" he asked, his tone low but sharp. "You said it was just an old storage shed, and now there's a little girl who survived and a notebook full of victim names." James shot up, slamming his hands down on the table. "I don't know how she survived," he yelled, his eyes wild. "I thought she was—" He paused, realized he had just slipped up, and Robert tightened his grip on his shoulder. "Shut up," Robert snapped. "If the girl identifies you, I can't save you anymore." The hallways suddenly buzzed with activity as the sound of the rescue vehicle's siren echoed from a mile away, approaching the courthouse. John stepped up to the glass door, watching the white ambulance glide down the main road, its red lights flashing. "They're here," he said, his voice low yet filled with excitement. Anna rushed to stand beside him, clutching her chest, her heart racing. The ambulance pulled up to the main entrance at 1:35 p.m., and 2 paramedics emerged, carefully wheeling Sophie Bennett out in a wheelchair. The little girl wore a white hospital gown, her face pale but her eyes brighter than they had been when she was found in the basement 5 hours earlier. A social worker accompanied them, holding a medical file, her expression serious yet gentle. John and Anna rushed to greet them, with Shadow following closely behind Lily as she stood up, still gripping the leash tightly. "Sophie," Anna said, kneeling down to be at eye level with the little girl, her voice gentle. "I'm Anna. Do you remember me? We talked on the phone from the hospital." Sophie nodded weakly, her hand still clutching the social worker's hand. "I remember," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I want to help." Anna smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You're so brave," she said. "We just need you to look at a man and tell us if you recognize him. Shadow will be there with you." Shadow moved closer, nuzzling her head against Sophie's hand, and the little girl smiled a small but radiant smile, like sunlight breaking through the darkness. John knelt down, his eyes meeting Sophie's. "She's just like Lily," he whispered to Anna, his voice choked with emotion. "Both of them are stronger than we think." He stood up and turned to the social worker. "Can she go into the courtroom in 5 minutes?" he asked. The woman nodded. "She's stable," she said, "but don't keep her too long. She needs a rest afterward." The courtroom doors swung open at 1:45 p.m., and everyone rushed in, the chatter growing louder. James Carver entered alongside Robert Klein, his eyes wild as he spotted Sophie being wheeled in on a wheelchair, Shadow standing beside her like a guardian. The jury sat in silence, their gazes locked onto the tiny girl with a pale face but determined eyes. Daniel Pierce returned to the stand, tapping his gavel to signal for quiet. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice deep, "your witness has arrived. Proceed." Anna stepped forward, gently resting her hand on Sophie's shoulder as the wheelchair came to a stop near the witness stand. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice ringing clear. "This is Sophie Bennett, rescued this morning from the basement of James Carver. She will identify the man who kidnapped and held her captive for 6 months." She turned to Sophie, her tone softening. "Sophie, take a look around the room. Do you see the man who brought you to the basement?" Sophie looked up, her cloudy eyes scanning the room before landing on James Carver. She trembled, gripping Shadow's fur tightly, but her voice came out small yet firm. "Him," she said, pointing directly at James. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and James shot up, slamming his hands on the table. "The girl is lying," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Shadow growled loudly, his gaze locked onto James, and that growl pierced through the air like a knife, striking straight at the heart of the criminal. The tension in the air reached a boiling point as Sophie pointed her finger, and James's panic only fueled the fire. The moment of their ultimate confrontation had begun, and no one could stop the truth from erupting. The panicked scream of James Carver, "The girl is lying," echoed to the Harris County Courthouse at 1:50 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, shaking the courtroom like a minor earthquake. Sophie Bennett, sitting in a wheelchair near the witness stand, trembled as her tiny finger pointed directly at him. Yet her gaze remained unwavering, a remarkable steadiness in her frail body after 6 months of captivity. Shadow, the German shepherd, stood beside her, growling louder, his body tense, eyes locked onto James like an arrow ready to be released. The jury stared in shock, some with their mouths agape, while others whispered to one another, clearly caught up in this moment of confrontation. Robert Klein rushed over and pulled James down, gripping his shoulder tightly, his voice low but intense. "Sit down, James. You're killing yourself here." But James wouldn't listen. He stood there, slamming his hand down on the table again, his wild eyes darting over to Sophie, then Shadow, and finally landing on Anna Mitchell. "I don't know who that girl is," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They set me up, it's all a lie." But the growl from Shadow cut through his words, a wordless rebuttal, and this time no one in the jury had any doubts left. Daniel Pierce slammed the butt of his gavel down on the desk, the sound echoing through the room and silencing everyone. "Order," he barked, his icy gaze locked onto James. "Mr. Carver, you will have your chance to speak, but not by shouting in my courtroom." He turned to Anna, his tone low but serious. "Ms. Mitchell, please continue. I want to hear from the witness." Anna nodded, stepping closer to Sophie, kneeling down to be at eye level with her, her hand gently resting on the girl's shoulder. "Sophie," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "are you sure that man is the one who took you? Just tell the truth, it's okay." Sophie took a deep breath, her hand gripping Shadow's fur, as if searching for strength. "He," she whispered, her voice hoarse yet clear. "He put me in the truck, talked about puppies, then locked me in the basement." I remember his voice. She looked up at Anna, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her gaze remained fixed on James. "He scared me." The courtroom fell silent, with only Sophie's small sobs and Shadow's low growl echoing in the air. Anna stood up, turning to the jury, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sophie Bennett survived 6 months in the hands of James Carver. She recognized him not just by his face, but by his voice, by the same seductive words he used on Lily Harper." John Harper, from the audience, tightened his grip on Lily's hand, feeling her quickening breath. He glanced over at Sarah, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. The pain Sophie endured was the pain Lily almost had to face. "She's braver than I was back in Iraq," he whispered to Sarah, his voice choked with emotion. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, her hand gripping her husband's tightly as if clinging to an anchor in the midst of a storm. Anna raised the black notebook once more, her voice booming like thunder. This notebook was found in the Carver house, listing the names of Sophie Emma Sullivan and dozens of other victims over the years. This isn't just a kidnapping. It's a criminal network. And Shadow, the dog that Carver stabbed during the raid on March 15th, 2022, led us to the truth. She pointed at James, her gaze sharp as a knife. He can't deny it anymore, not with Sophie, not with Shadow, not with this evidence. Robert Klein stood up, his voice trembling but trying to maintain his composure. "Your Honor," he said, "the testimony of an 8-year-old child who has just been traumatized is unreliable. She could be influenced, and that notebook could be fabricated. We request time to investigate." But Daniel Pierce raised his hand, his gaze as cold as ice. "Mr. Klein, I have given you ample time," he said. "The jury will assess the credibility of the witness and the evidence. Sit down." James Carver shot up again, pointing at Sophie. "The kid doesn't know anything," he yelled. But before he could say more, Shadow lunged forward, the leash slipping from Lily's hand. The dog stopped 5 feet from the defendant's table, growling loudly, its gaze locked onto James like a verdict. The courtroom erupted in a chorus of gasps and whispers, and 2 security officers rushed in to restrain Shadow, but the dog didn't attack. It just stood there unblinking, like a warrior defending justice. Daniel Pierce struck the end of his cane again, the sound echoing. "Get that dog back in its place," he shouted, and John rushed over to pull Shadow back beside Lily, his hand stroking the dog's fur to calm him down. "Easy, Shadow," he whispered, his voice low. "You did good." Shadow sat down, but its gaze remained fixed on James, and this time, James didn't dare to shout anymore. He sat down, hands clutching his head, his face pale, as if he had just lost all his strength. Anna turned to Daniel, her voice steady. "Your Honor, we have presented enough testimony from Sophie, Shadow's reactions, the notebook, and evidence from the truck. James Carver is a serial kidnapper, and we asked the jury to reach a verdict." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I agree," he said. "The court will take a 15-minute recess for the jury to prepare for deliberation. We will reconvene at 2:15 p.m. John held Lily and Sarah close, feeling the warmth of family amidst the storm. The tension peaked with Sophie's testimony and Shadow's actions, but this brief break brought a moment of peace. Justice was drawing near, and James Carver had nowhere left to run. The hallway of the Harris County Courthouse was enveloped in a rare silence as the 15-minute break began at 2 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, following Sophie Bennett's heavy testimony and Shadow's fierce reaction to James Carver. John Harper sat on the wooden bench, holding Lily tightly. The little girl nestled against him, her tiny hands gripping Shadow's leash like a lifeline. Shadow lay by their feet, ears drooping, eyes softening but still alert. Sarah sat beside him, holding John's hand, her gaze bright with hope. For the first time in months, she felt that justice was no longer just a distant dream. Anna Mitchell stood near the courtroom door, holding a cup of water but not drinking it, her gaze distant as if she were sorting through everything in her mind. She approached the Harper family, kneeling down to Lily's level, her voice gentle. "Lily, you did so well today," she said, smiling. "Shadow and Sophie did too. We're almost there." Lily didn't respond, but she looked up, her green eyes sparkling with a hint of light, a sign that she was slowly coming back. Anna stood up, glancing at John. "The jury won't take long," she whispered. "With Sophie, Shadow, and a notebook, they can't overlook it." John nodded, his hand stroking Shadow's fur, his gaze thoughtful. "I've seen teammates fall in Iraq 10 years ago," he said, his voice warm. "But I've never seen a dog change the world like Shadow has." He looked at Lily, then at Sarah, and a rare smile spread across his face. He didn't just save Sophie, he saved our little girl. Sarah hugged Lily tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. "Thank God for Shadow," she whispered. The courtroom door swung open at 2:15 p.m., and everyone stepped inside, the atmosphere heavy yet filled with anticipation. James Carver sat at the defendant's table, his head cradled in his hands, his gaze vacant. The arrogance he once held had crumbled after Sophie's testimony and Shadow's roar. Robert Klein sat beside him, his expression tense, fully aware that the chance for a defense was now just a fragile thread. Daniel Pierce returned to the podium, tapping the butt of his gavel to signal for silence. "The jury is ready to deliberate," he said, his voice deep. "They will return with a verdict when they are ready." The jury left the room, and the air was thick with anticipation. John held Lily and Sarah close, feeling the steady rhythm of his family's breaths. "Sophie, in her wheelchair in the hallway with the social worker, gazed at Shadow through the glass, offering a faint smile of silent thank you. Anna stood near the prosecutor's table, gripping her black notebook tightly, her gaze resolute yet relieved. Just 30 minutes later, at 2:45 p.m., the jury returned faster than anyone expected. Daniel looked at them, his gaze serious. "Do you have a verdict?" he asked. The foreman of the jury nodded, his voice ringing out. "Yes, Your Honor." The tension that had reached its peak was now behind them, and a gentle calm spread as the moment of confrontation came to an end, with justice ready to deliver its verdict. The courtroom door of the Harris County Courthouse closed at 2:45 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, as the jury entered the deliberation room after the heavy testimony of Sophie Bennett and the undeniable evidence from James Carver's Black Book. John Harper sat on the wooden bench in the hallway, holding Lily tightly in his arms. The little girl nestled against him, her small hands gripping Shadow's leash like a lifeline, keeping her from drifting into darkness. Shadow lay at their feet, his sleek black coat glistening under the hallway lights, his deep-set eyes now calm, like a warrior who had just completed his mission. Sarah sat beside him, holding John's hand, her eyes shining with hope not only because justice was about to be served, but also because she sensed a tiny shift in Lily, a glimmer of light breaking through after months of silence. Anna Mitchell stood a few steps away, holding a cup of cold coffee, her gaze distant yet relieved. She approached the Harper family, kneeling down to Lily's level, her voice gentle. "Lily, you did so well today," she said, smiling. "Shadow and Sophie did great too. Now, we just need to wait a little longer." Lily didn't respond, but she looked up, her green eyes shining with a small spark not in words, but as a sign that she was listening, that she was feeling. Anna stood up, glancing at John. "The jury won't take long," she whispered. "With everything they've seen Sophie, Shadow, the notebook, I believe they'll make the right decision." John nodded, gently running his fingers through Lily's curly hair, his gaze thoughtful. "I used to think justice was all we needed," he said, his voice warm. "But looking at Lily today, I realize we need more than that. We need her back." Sarah tightened her grip on his hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she smiled. "She's trying, John," she whispered. "I can see it in her eyes. Shadow has helped her find herself again." John looked down at Shadow, the dog who had once been a K-9 for the Houston Police Department, who had been stabbed by James Carver 3 years ago, and now had become a companion that was saving his daughter. "You're a warrior, Shadow," he said, stroking the dog's fur, "and you've never given up." In the hallway, Sophie Bennett sat in a wheelchair with a social worker about 20 feet away from the Harper family. She looked frail, her face pale after 6 months of captivity, but her eyes sparkled as she gazed at Shadow from a distance. "Thank you, dog," she whispered to the social worker, her voice hoarse yet clear. The woman smiled, jotting down something in the file. "Shadow is a hero, Sophie," she said, "and so are you." Sophie nodded, her hand reaching out as if she wanted to touch the dog once more, but the distance was too great. Still, her gaze met Shadow's, a silent thank you exchange between them. In the jury room, the jurors sat around a long wooden table, the atmosphere heavy yet filled with determination. The leader, a woman in her 50s named Ellen, flipped open a black notebook, her voice deep but steady. "We have Sophie identifying Carver, the notebook with the victim's name, and the items found in the truck," she said, glancing around the table. "Not to mention, Shadow, I've never seen a dog react like that. What do you all think?" An older man nodded. "I believe the girl," he said. "And that notebook, it sends chills down my spine. He's guilty." The others nodded in agreement. And just 20 minutes into deliberation, faster than anyone expected, they reached a consensus. The hallway gradually filled up as the clock struck 3 p.m., signaling that the court session was about to resume. John stood up, lifting Lily into his arms, feeling the warmth of her little body against him. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Lily didn't say a word, but she nodded, her hand gently stroking Shadow's fur, and for the first time in months, she rested her head on her dad's shoulder, a small gesture, but one full of meaning, like a door slowly creaking open after being tightly shut for so long. Sarah stood beside them, tears streaming down her face, but she smiled. "She's coming back, John," she whispered. "I knew it." The courtroom door swung open, and everyone stepped inside, filled with anticipation. James Carver sat at the defendant's table, cradling his head in his hands, his eyes vacant. The arrogance he once held had crumbled after Sophie's testimony and Shadow's roar. Robert Klein sat beside him, hurriedly taking notes, but his expression was tense, fully aware that all his efforts at defense were now futile. Daniel Pierce returned to the podium, tapping his gavel to signal silence. "The jury has returned," he said, his deep voice resonating. "They have reached a verdict." Ellen, the head juror, stood up, holding the verdict paper, her voice clear. "Your Honor, we find the defendant James Carver guilty on all counts of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and endangerment of a child." The courtroom erupted in a buzz of whispers, but this time it was a mix of sighs of relief and joy. James hung his head, his hands covered his face, too defeated to fight back. Robert Klein sat silently, his gaze vacant, like a man who had just lost a final game of chess. John held Lily tighter, feeling her heart race in her chest. Sarah took his hand, tears streaming down her face, but she wore a bright smile. "We did it," she whispered. Shadow looked up, his gaze soft on Lily, as if he understood that justice was not just for Sophie, but also for this little girl. The emotions in the air intensified with the verdict, but as people began to leave the room, a gentle peace spread, marking the beginning of Lily's healing journey from here. The whispers in the Harris County Courthouse quieted down at 3:05 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, as the jury left the courtroom after delivering a guilty verdict for James Carver. John Harper stood up, cradling Lily in his arms. The little girl nestled against his shoulder, her tiny hands gripping the leash of Shadow tightly, as if she never wanted to let go. Shadow walked alongside them, his sleek black fur shining under the lights, his gaze gentle yet resolute, like a steadfast companion who had journeyed through the darkness with her. Sarah followed closely, holding John's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her smile was brighter than ever justice had been served, and now she felt a new door opening for their family. Anna Mitchell stepped forward, holding a file that was no longer needed, her eyes shining with a mix of joy and exhaustion. "We did it," she said, her voice ringing with relief. "James Carver has been convicted on all charges of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and more. He'll never see the outside of a prison again." She knelt down to Lily's level, smiling. "Lily, you were a huge part of this victory. You and Shadow." Lily didn't respond, but she looked up, her emerald eyes sparkling with a brightness that spoke louder than words' connection, a sign that she was listening, feeling more deeply. John set Lily down on the floor, still holding her hand, his gaze locking with Anna's. "Thank you, Anna," he said, his voice warm yet choked with emotion, not just for Carver, but for helping us keep Lily safe. He recalled the dark days following the attack in Spring Branch 10 months ago, when Lily's cheerful laughter vanished, replaced by a haunting silence. As a former Marine who had faced enemies from 300 feet away in the dark, John had never felt so powerless until Shadow entered their lives. "This dog didn't just find Sophie," he said, stroking Shadow's fur. "It found our little girl." Sarah hugged Anna, her tears now tears of joy. "You have no idea what this means to us," she whispered. Lily hasn't said a word since that day, but today, I saw her smile, I saw her lean on John. That's all I've ever prayed for. Anna hugged her back, her voice trembling. "I'm just doing my job," she said. "But Lily and Shadow, they're the real heroes." She looked at Shadow, her gaze softening. "This dog has done what no lawyer or judge ever could. He's brought hope." In the hallway, Sophie Bennett sat in her wheelchair alongside a social worker about 20 feet away from the Harper family. She watched Lily and Shadow through the glass, gripping the social worker's hand tightly, her voice a faint whisper. "That girl looks like me," she said, her eyes lighting up as she recalled the dark basement where she had been held for 6 months. "That dog saved both of us." The social worker smiled, jotting something down in her notes. "You'll be home soon, Sophie," she said. "And so will Lily. You both are stronger than you think." Sophie nodded, her hand reaching out as if to touch Shadow once more, a silent thank you shared between two girls who had faced the same darkness. John led Lily down the hallway, with Shadow walking beside them, and as they approached Sophie, Lily stopped. She looked at Sophie, her green eyes wide open, then slowly let go of John's hand. She stepped closer to the wheelchair, still holding on to Shadow's leash. And for the first time in months, she did the unexpected. She reached out and gently touched Sophie's hand. Sophie looked up, surprised, and then took Lily's hand, their small hands trembling but warm as they intertwined. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse. Lily didn't say anything, but she nodded, a small smile blooming on her fragile lips, genuine and bright like the first sunlight after long winter. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and turned to John. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "The little girl, she's coming back." John nodded, gripping his wife's shoulder tightly, his eyes shining bright. "Shadow has opened the door," he said, his voice deep, "and Sophie just helped her step through." He knelt beside Lily, wrapping her in his arms, feeling her heart race against his chest. "You make me so proud, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice trembling with feeling. Shadow nuzzled against Lily and Sophie, its gaze gentle yet resolute, like a promise that it would always be there. Anna stood a few steps away, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed that moment. She recalled the first day she met Lily, a quiet, withdrawn girl with empty eyes after the attack on May 15th, 2024. Now, that girl was holding hands with another victim, smiling, healing it all thanks to Shadow, thanks to Sophie, and thanks to the unwavering love of the Harper family. "We didn't just win the case," she whispered to herself. "We saved two little girls." The hallway gradually fell silent as everyone left, but the Harper family and Sophie remained, as if wanting to hold on to that magical moment a little longer. John stood up, lifting Lily into his arms, his gaze meeting Sarah's for a brief moment. "Let's go home," he said, his voice warm and deep. "We've fought long enough. Now it's time to live." Sarah nodded, holding Sophie's hand one last time before the social worker wheeled her away. "See you later, Sophie," she said, smiling. The emotions in the air reached a peak as Lily and Sophie touched hands, a powerful healing moment between two girls who had lost everything. But as the Harper family left the courthouse, a gentle sense of peace spread, signaling that Lily's healing journey was not just beginning, but blossoming, with each small step taken firmly forward. The sunset bathed the Houston sky in golden hues as the Harper family stepped out of the Harris County Courthouse at 3:30 p.m. on March 21st, 2025, leaving behind a guilty verdict for James Carver and the dark days that followed. John Harper cradled Lily in his arms, her little head resting on his shoulder, her tiny hands clutching Shadow's leash like an unbreakable bond. Shadow walked beside them, his sleek black coat shimmering in the sunlight, his deep eyes now filled with peace, like a warrior who had completed his mission and was finally returning home with his family. Sarah followed closely, holding John's hand, her eyes shining with joy and hope. For the first time in 10 months, she felt that their family was truly whole again. They walked over to the truck parked 50 feet from the courthouse, the cool evening air brushing against Lily's face. She looked up, her green eyes gazing at the sky, then down at Shadow, and a miracle happened. She whispered, her voice soft as the wind, but clear, for the first time since May 15th, 2024. "Thank you, Shadow." John froze, his heart pounding, turning to Sarah with a look of disbelief. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, then rushed to hug Lily, her voice choked with emotion. "Sweetheart, you spoke. You can talk now." She held the little girl tightly, feeling the warmth and heartbeat of her daughter, like a precious gift just rediscovered. John knelt down, placing Lily gently on the ground, his hands trembling as he brushed her curly hair. "What did you just say, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice deep but trembling with emotion. Lily looked at her dad, then at Shadow, and repeated, her voice a bit clearer this time. "Thank you, Shadow." Shadow looked up, nuzzling against Lily's hand, its gaze tender as if in response. John wrapped Lily in his arms, tears streaming down his cheeks for the first time, the tough Marine veteran who had faced countless dangers. "You make me so proud," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're stronger than I ever was." Sarah knelt beside them, embracing both Lily and John, the three of them wrapped in a warm hug in a quiet parking lot. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "She's back with us, really back." Shadow sat nearby, resting his head on Lily's lap, an inseparable part of the family. John looked at the dog, remembering the days that had guided them through the darkness. From the courtroom to the basement near Sam Houston National Forest, from fear to hope. "You're our hero, Shadow," he said, stroking the dog's fur. They got in the car, and John drove slowly toward their home in Spring Branch, 5 miles away. The sunset gradually faded, giving way to a starry sky. Lily sat between John and Sarah, still holding on to Shadow's leash, her eyes wide as she gazed out the window. She didn't say anything more, but the small smile on her face was enough of a promise that she would continue to heal one day at a time. Emotions peaked when Lily spoke her first word, but as the car rolled toward home, a sense of peace spread. Lily's healing journey had begun, and the Harper family felt more complete than ever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Lily, Shadow, and the Harper family, a story of loyalty, courage, and hope that never fades. From Shadow's growl in the darkness to Lily's first smile, we've witnessed the power of love overcoming all fears. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and subscribe to the Legendary Narratives channel so you won't miss other inspiring tales. Every interaction from you fuels our passion to keep sharing these beautiful values. Goodbye for now, and thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon. Together, we create timeless legends.